What if our closest planetary neighbor once hid an advanced alien civilization? For decades, UFO researchers and contactees claimed that mysterious beings known as the Venusians traveled from Venus to Earth with warnings about humanity's future and messages of peace. But there's one major problem. Modern science describes Venus as a scorching world, hot enough to melt lead, making life as we know it extremely unlikely. So where did the legend of the Venusians come from? Were they real extraterrestrials, misunderstood visitors from somewhere else, or simply one of the greatest mysteries in UFO history? In this video, we uncover the truth behind the Venusian alien race and the stories that continue to fascinate believers around the world. There is a point in the evening, just after the sun has slipped below the horizon, when a single light appears low in the western sky, brighter than every star around it, brighter than anything else up there except the moon. Ancient people saw it and called it a god. Babylonian priests tracked it across the centuries and recorded its movements on clay tablets that still survive today. Egyptian astronomers folded it into their cosmology as both a morning messenger and an evening watcher, unaware for a long time that the object rising before dawn and the object setting after dusk were the same body. The Maya built entire calendars around its cycles, timing wars and coronations to its appearances. Long before anyone had a telescope, long before anyone understood what a planet even was, humanity had already decided that this particular point of light mattered more than the others. That light is Venus, and the story of what people have believed about it for thousands of years is one of the strangest and most persistent stories in the entire history of human imagination. This is a series about that story, not simply about the planet itself, though we will spend real time on what Venus actually is, what it's made of, what a spacecraft would find if it dropped through those clouds and landed on that surface. This is a series about the idea of Venus, about the layer of belief, speculation, mythology, and outright claim that human beings have built on top of the physical planet over the centuries, culminating in one of the most persistent and strange chapters in 20th century culture. The widespread belief held by ordinary people, self-described contactees, occult teachers, and for a time even entertained at the edges of official government inquiry that Venus was inhabited. Not by microbes, not by some theoretical extremophile clinging to a survivable pocket of atmosphere, but by people, by an advanced human-like civilization that had, according to the men and women who claimed to have met them, been quietly observing Earth for a very long time and had finally decided to make contact. We are going to call these beings, as they were called by the people who claimed to encounter them, the Venusians. And before we go any further, it's worth being honest about what this series is and is not. This is not a case being built for the existence of an advanced civilization currently living on the second planet from the sun. The physical case against that idea is about as strong as physical cases get, and we will walk through it in careful detail later on because it deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. What this series is, instead, is an honest account of a genuinely remarkable episode in modern history. The story of why so many people, across so many decades, came to believe something so extraordinary, what they claimed happened to them, who they said they met, what those beings supposedly looked like and said and wanted, and how that belief moved from cranks and dreamers into something that touched serious institutions, serious scientists, and a surprisingly large slice of ordinary public opinion. To understand why Venus became the focus of this belief rather than Mars, or the Moon, or some more distant world, you have to understand what Venus looked like to the naked eye and the early telescope, long before spacecraft ever got close enough to send back the truth. From Earth, unaided, Venus is the third brightest object in the sky, after the Sun and the Moon. It never strays far from the Sun in the sky, which is why it only ever appears as a morning star or an evening star, never at midnight, and why ancient cultures took so long to realize the two appearances were a single object making a single, if oddly timed, path across the heavens. It is almost exactly the same size as Earth, a fact that would only be confirmed with precision instruments centuries later, but even early observers had a sense that Venus was, in the words later astronomers would use, Earth's twin. Similar size, similar mass, similar distance from the Sun compared to the other planets, similar density, similar overall composition of rock and metal. If any other world in the solar system was going to turn out to be a mirror of our own, every early clue pointed toward Venus. Then there were the clouds. When Galileo first turned his telescope on Venus in the early 17th century, he was able to confirm that it went through phases like the Moon, a discovery that helped cement the Copernican model of the solar system, since it proved Venus orbited the Sun rather than the Earth. But what Galileo and every telescope observer after him for the next 350 years could not do was see through Venus's atmosphere to its surface. The planet is wrapped, permanently and completely, in a thick layer of cloud that has never, in the entire history of Earth-based observation, parted enough to reveal so much as a glimpse of solid ground. Mars, by contrast, revealed its polar ice caps, its dark and light regions, its apparent seasonal changes to 19th century observers with reasonably good telescopes. The Moon obviously showed its entire face. Even distant Jupiter revealed its banded clouds and its great red spot. Venus alone, the planet closest to Earth in size and orbit, kept its surface a total secret. And when human beings are denied information, they do not simply shrug and move on, they fill the gap. For 3.5 centuries, that gap was filled with imagination, and the imagination again and again filled it with life. Early telescopic observers speculated, quite reasonably given what they knew, that a planet wrapped in permanent cloud, similar in size to Earth and slightly closer to the Sun, was probably warmer and wetter than our own world. Some assumed the clouds meant a planet-wide ocean, its surface constantly evaporating moisture into the sky. Others assumed a humid, swampy world, not unlike what geologists believed Earth itself looked like during the Carboniferous period, hundreds of millions of years ago, when giant ferns and towering horsetail plants covered the land and the air was thick with moisture. This idea that Venus was essentially a preview of Earth's own prehistoric past took hold particularly strongly in the early 20th century and became known among astronomers, somewhat informally, as the swamp theory or the jungle Venus hypothesis. Respected scientists speculated in print about dense Venusian rainforests, warm, shallow seas, and the possibility of primitive reptilian life, imagining Venus as something like a living fossil of Earth's own younger self, permanently suspended earlier in its evolutionary story because of its position closer to the Sun. It's worth pausing on that point because it matters for everything that comes later in this series. The idea of a habitable, even jungle-like Venus was not, in the early 20th century, a fringe belief held only by mystics and dreamers. It was a legitimate scientific hypothesis, published by credentialed astronomers in respected journals, discussed at scientific conferences, and taught in some form in university classrooms. Nobody had proof either way, because nobody could see through the clouds, and in that absence of proof, serious scientists made serious, reasoned guesses based on the best available evidence, and those guesses pointed toward the possibility of life. This is the crucial soil in which the later, far more extraordinary claims about Venusians would eventually take root. The contactees who would emerge decades later, claiming to have met human-like beings from Venus, were not inventing their claims out of pure fantasy, detached from any scientific context. They were building on top of, and in some cases, directly citing, real scientific speculation that a habitable, Earth-like world existed right next door. By the middle of the 20th century, two very different cultural currents were converging on Venus at the same time. The first was this respectable scientific tradition of speculation about a warm, wet, possibly life-bearing planet hidden behind its clouds, tantalizingly unconfirmed. The second was a much older and stranger tradition, running through 19th century occultism and esoteric spirituality, which had already populated Venus with intelligent beings for entirely different reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with astronomy and everything to do with a particular strand of mystical thinking about human spiritual evolution. We will spend an entire part of this series later on tracing that esoteric tradition in detail, because it matters enormously to understanding where the later, more famous contactee claims actually came from. For now, it's enough to know that by the 1950s, when the first and most famous Venusian contact claims exploded into public consciousness, there were already two separate, well-established streams of thought, one scientific and one mystical, both of which had already concluded, for their own reasons, that Venus was inhabited. Then came the 1950s themselves, a decade that in hindsight looks almost perfectly engineered to produce exactly the phenomenon this series is about. The Second World War had just ended, and with it had come the atomic bomb, an invention that had permanently and visibly demonstrated that human beings now possessed the power to destroy their own civilization. The Cold War was beginning, bringing with it a pervasive, low-grade dread about nuclear annihilation that settled into the background of ordinary daily life across the world. At the very same time, the technology of flight itself was advancing at a startling pace. Jet aircraft, still a novelty to most civilians, were breaking the sound barrier. Rockets that had been built to deliver warheads were now being repurposed, however crudely, to think about spaceflight. The public's sense of what was technologically possible was being rewritten on almost a monthly basis, and into that atmosphere of anxiety and rapid technological change came a wave, starting in 1947, of reported sightings of strange craft in the sky, sightings that quickly acquired a name: flying saucers. It's important to understand that the flying saucer phenomenon and the specific claim of Venusian contact, while closely related, are not quite the same thing, and much of the confusion in popular memory around this topic comes from conflating them. The saucer sightings of the late 1940s were, in the vast majority of cases, reports of strange lights or shapes in the sky, described by ordinary witnesses without any accompanying claim of communication or physical meeting. The Venusian contact claims that we will spend much of this series examining were something different and considerably more extraordinary. Specific individuals, a small number of them, coming forward not merely to say they had seen something odd in the sky, but to say they had met, spoken with, and in some cases been taken aboard a craft by a physical human-like being who identified himself, or in a few tellings herself, as a native of the planet Venus. These individuals became known, at the time and ever since, as contactees, a term deliberately distinguished from the more general term abductee, which came into use later and describes a very different kind of claimed experience, typically involuntary and often frightening, in contrast to the contactees, most of whom describe their experiences as invited, benevolent, and often spiritually uplifting. The most famous of these contactees, a man whose name will come up repeatedly throughout this series, was a Polish-American amateur astronomer and philosopher living in California named George Adamski. In November of 1952, Adamski claimed he had walked out into the California desert, accompanied by several witnesses who later signed sworn statements attesting to what they saw, and encountered a small scout craft that had descended from a larger cigar-shaped mothership. From that scout craft, Adamski claimed, emerged a human being, roughly Adamski's own height, with long blonde hair, high cheekbones, and an unusually serene and gentle expression, who communicated with Adamski partly through telepathy and partly through gestures, and who eventually identified himself as coming from the planet Venus. Adamski gave this being the name Orthon, and the story of that meeting, expanded into a book that Adamski co-wrote the following year, became arguably the single most influential UFO-related publication of the entire 20th century. We will devote an entire part of this series to Adamski's claims specifically because the details matter, the witnesses matter, the physical evidence Adamski claimed to have, including photographs he said he took of Venusian scout craft, all matter, and because understanding exactly what Adamski said, in his own words and in the words of those around him, is essential before we can evaluate it fairly. Adamski was not alone for long. Within a few years of his claims becoming public, a number of other individuals came forward with strikingly similar stories, some claiming contact with beings specifically from Venus, others describing contact with beings from a loosely defined confederation of planets that was said to include Venus among its member worlds. Howard Menger, a sign painter from New Jersey, claimed to have been in contact with Venusians since childhood, describing them as remarkably beautiful, almost impossibly serene people who eventually invited him aboard their craft and even, in his later and more elaborate accounts, took him briefly to the Venusian surface itself. Truman Bathorum, a shift worker in the Mojave Desert, claimed to have met the female captain of a Venusian craft, a woman he called Aura Rains, whom he described in his subsequent writings and lecture tours with an admiration that, viewed today, reads as clearly romantic in nature. Cedric Allingham, writing from the United Kingdom, published his own account of a Venusian encounter that closely mirrored Adamski's story in its structure and detail, a similarity that would later become a significant point of controversy when researchers began to suspect the entire account might have been an elaborate hoax. We will examine each of these figures individually in their own dedicated part later in the series because each one adds a different texture to the overall picture, and because the differences between their accounts are just as revealing as the similarities. What these contactees described was remarkably consistent in its broad strokes, even though the individual details varied. The Venusians, as described across dozens of these accounts throughout the 1950s, were almost never depicted as strange or monstrous. They were, virtually without exception, described as beautiful by human standards, tall, slender, often blonde or light-haired, with pale, unblemished skin and an expression of profound calm. They spoke, when they spoke at all, of peace, of concern for humanity's newly acquired nuclear weapons, of a desire to help Earth avoid destroying itself, and of a spiritual wisdom far beyond anything achieved on Earth. They were rarely described as technologically incomprehensible in the way later alien encounter narratives would describe advanced beings. Instead, their technology was often presented as an extension of natural law, powered by principles the contactees described in quasi-mystical terms involving magnetism, cosmic rays, or universal energy, rather than the colder, more mechanistic technology of later science fiction. In other words, the Venusians of the contactee movement were not merely extraterrestrials. They were something closer to angels, wrapped in the borrowed language of 1950s aerospace culture. This is not an incidental detail. It is, as we will see later in this series, one of the most important clues to where these beliefs actually originated. Because here is the question that any honest examination of this phenomenon has to sit with directly. If we set aside, for the moment, the question of whether any of these encounters actually happened as described, and instead ask a different question, namely, where did the idea of a peaceful, spiritually advanced, blonde, human-like race living on Venus come from in the first place? The answer takes us somewhere unexpected. It takes us not to the space program, not to any government file, but backward into the 19th century, into the writings of occult movements that had already, decades before the first flying saucer sighting, described spiritually advanced beings living on Venus, using language that the 20th century contactees would echo almost word for word. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875 by Helena Blavatsky, taught a complex cosmology in which advanced spiritual masters, sometimes called the Great White Brotherhood, were said to guide human evolution from hidden locations, and later, theosophical writers explicitly placed some of these advanced beings on Venus, describing the planet as spiritually further evolved than Earth and its inhabitants as correspondingly advanced. By the time Adamski described meeting a serene, blonde Venusian named Orthon in the California desert, The idea of Venus as home to a spiritually superior human-like race had already been circulating in esoteric literature for the better part of a century. We will trace this lineage carefully in the parts of this series devoted to the esoteric roots of the Venusian myth, because it is, in many ways, the real origin story here, more so than any single contactee's individual account. At the same time that these contact claims were circulating through lecture halls, self-published books, and the growing UFO subculture of the 1950s, an entirely separate and far more sober conversation was happening within actual government and military circles, and Venus, remarkably, was not entirely absent from it. The United States Air Force's Project Blue Book, the official government investigation into unidentified flying object reports that ran from 1952 until 1969, fielded and cataloged thousands of sighting reports throughout its existence, and while the overwhelming majority of contactee claims, including Adamski's, were dismissed by Blue Book investigators as fraudulent or delusional, the sheer scale of public interest in the broader UFO question meant that Venus, as the most talked about candidate for an inhabited neighboring world, came up repeatedly in the public conversation Blue Book was created partly to manage. We will look in detail later in this series at how government agencies handled the Venusian question specifically, including the surprisingly serious way some of these claims were initially logged and investigated before being set aside, and what that reveals about the anxious, uncertain atmosphere of the early Cold War, when the idea of contact with an advanced civilization, benevolent or otherwise, felt disturbingly plausible to ordinary people and officials alike. All of this, the contactee movement, the esoteric roots, the government's uneasy relationship with the whole phenomenon, took place against the backdrop of a scientific mystery that had not yet been resolved. Remember, until spacecraft actually reached Venus, nobody on Earth could prove the contactees wrong about the basic physical conditions on the planet. The swamp theory and the jungle Venus hypothesis were still live scientific possibilities well into the 1950s. It was entirely reasonable, given the actual state of scientific knowledge at the time, for an ordinary person to hear that Venus might be a warm, humid, life-bearing world and find that entirely credible, because leading astronomers were saying essentially the same thing in scientific journals. The contactees were not asking the public to believe something science had already ruled out. They were asking the public to believe something science had not yet been able to check. That distinction matters enormously, and it helps explain why so many otherwise reasonable people, including some scientists and public officials, were willing to at least entertain the possibility that Adamski and the others might be telling the truth, or some version of it. That state of uncertainty would not last. In December of 1962, the American spacecraft Mariner 2 became the first human-made object to successfully fly past another planet, and the planet it flew past was Venus. What Mariner 2's instruments found, and what the Soviet Venera landers would go on to confirm in even more brutal detail over the following 2 decades, ended the swamp theory and the jungle Venus hypothesis permanently and without any real room for scientific doubt. We will cover those findings in full, unflinching detail later in this series, because the true physical nature of Venus, once it was finally revealed, turned out to be so extreme, so genuinely hostile to any form of life as we understand it, that the contrast between what the contactees had described and what the spacecraft actually found became one of the starkest scientific rebuttals in the entire history of the UFO phenomenon. But it is worth saying clearly, here at the outset, that even this definitive scientific answer did not end the Venusian legend. It changed its shape. It pushed some believers toward more elaborate explanations involving underground cities or higher dimensional beings unaffected by surface conditions, while it pushed others away from the movement entirely. And decades later, in a strange and almost poetic twist, actual mainstream astrobiology would return to Venus with a genuinely serious, peer-reviewed scientific hypothesis about a very different, far more modest kind of life, not a civilization of blonde humanoids, but potentially microbial life surviving in a temperate band of Venus's upper clouds, a hypothesis that made international headlines in 2020 and remains a live, contested area of active research to this day. We will cover that story too, in full, later in this series, because it closes the loop in a way that neither the wildest contactee nor the harshest skeptic from the 1950s could have fully anticipated. So that is the shape of the story we are about to tell across the parts that follow. We will go back to the ancient world and trace how Venus became a god before it became a planet. We will follow the telescope era and the genuine scientific speculation about a habitable Venusian surface that set the stage for everything that came after. We will examine, one by one, the major contactees of the 1950s and what specifically each of them claimed. We will trace the esoteric and occult tradition that gave the Venusian myth its distinctive spiritual character long before any flying saucer was ever reported. We will look at how governments, militaries, and the scientific establishment responded in real time to a public that increasingly believed its closest planetary neighbor might be inhabited. We will walk through the spacecraft data that ended the debate about Venus's surface once and for all. And we will end with the genuinely surprising modern chapter in which serious scientists, using serious instruments, went looking for life on Venus again, in a place none of the original contactees had ever thought to look. Along the way, we are going to try to hold two things at once, honestly and without flinching from either one. A real respect for how strange, how detailed, and how sincerely believed these accounts were by the people who told them, and a clear-eyed commitment to what the physical evidence actually shows. Venus, it turns out, did not need to be inhabited by a civilization of serene blonde travelers to be one of the strangest and most revealing chapters in the story of how humanity has always looked at its neighboring worlds and seen more than anything else a reflection of its own hopes and fears. That story starts, as so many strange stories do, with the ancient world looking up at a bright light in the evening sky and deciding it had to mean something. Venus in the ancient world. Long before anyone called it a planet, Venus was already a character. Every civilization that left behind a written record of the sky seems to have noticed the same thing. A light brighter than any star, appearing only near sunrise or sunset, never at midnight, moving through the heavens on a schedule so regular it could be predicted years in advance. And every civilization that noticed this light did the same thing with it. They gave it a personality. They built rituals around it. They used it to decide when to go to war, when to crown a king, when to plant crops, and when to fear the future. To understand why, centuries later, ordinary people in California and New Jersey found it entirely plausible that beings from Venus were visiting Earth in physical spacecraft, it helps to understand just how deep and how old the idea of Venus as a living, meaningful, almost personal presence in the sky actually runs. The contactees of the 1950s did not invent the idea that Venus mattered. They inherited it from a chain of belief stretching back at least 4,000 years. The oldest surviving detailed astronomical record of Venus comes from ancient Mesopotamia, and it is a remarkable document by any standard, ancient or modern. Known today as the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, named for the Babylonian king during whose reign the observations were reportedly made, this cuneiform tablet, copied and recopied by scribes over centuries and surviving today in fragments held in the British Museum, records the appearances and disappearances of Venus in the morning and evening sky over a period of about 21 years. The precision of the record is genuinely impressive. Babylonian astronomer priests were not casual observers. They tracked Venus with a rigor that allowed later scholars to use the tablet to help calibrate ancient Mesopotamian chronology itself, cross-referencing the recorded planetary positions against known astronomical cycles to help date other historical events. But the tablet was not compiled for scientific curiosity in the modern sense. It was compiled because Venus's movements were believed to be omens, messages from the gods about the fate of the kingdom, and the priests whose job it was to interpret the sky needed a reliable record to know when Venus was behaving normally and when its behavior signaled that something was about to go wrong. The Babylonians identified Venus with the goddess Ishtar, one of the most powerful and complicated deities in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon. Ishtar was not a gentle goddess. She was associated simultaneously with love and with war, with fertility and with violent conquest, a duality that mirrored Venus's own dual nature in the sky as both the herald of morning and the herald of evening. Temples were built to her across Mesopotamia, hymns were composed in her honor, and kings sought her favor before military campaigns, believing that Ishtar, watching from her position as the brightest light in the sky, held real power over the outcome of battles. This association between Venus and both love and war would echo forward through nearly every subsequent culture that inherited or independently developed a Venus mythology, suggesting that something about the planet's brightness, its intensity, and its unpredictable appearances near the horizon naturally lent itself to being cast as a figure of powerful, dangerous, and desirable force, rather than a calm or neutral presence. Further west, in ancient Egypt, Venus was understood somewhat differently, though it retained its dual morning and evening character. Egyptian astronomer priests, who were deeply concerned with the cycles of the sky as they related to the cycles of the Nile and the agricultural calendar that depended on it, tracked Venus as two separate entities for a significant stretch of their history, a morning star and an evening star, each with its own name and its own set of associations, before eventually recognizing, as most ancient cultures eventually did, that the two were the same body appearing on opposite sides of the sun. Egyptian religious texts link Venus to several different deities, depending on the era and the region, reflecting the way Egyptian religious thought absorbed and reorganized itself over thousands of years of continuous civilization. But the underlying pattern remains consistent with what we see in Mesopotamia. Venus was never simply background scenery. It was always doing something, always meaning something, always worth the attention of the priests whose entire professional purpose was to read the will of the gods in the patterns of the sky. The realization that the morning star and the evening star were one and the same object is often credited, in the Western tradition, to the Greek philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, sometime around the 6th century before the Common Era, although the truth is almost certainly more complicated, since Babylonian astronomers appear to have understood this fact considerably earlier, and the credit given to Pythagoras likely reflects the way Greek sources tended to consolidate scientific credit onto famous individual names, rather than acknowledging a slower, more collective process of astronomical observation across cultures. Whatever the true origin of the insight, the Greeks eventually settled on calling the morning appearance of Venus Phosphorus, meaning light bringer, and the evening appearance Hesperus, meaning star of the evening, before eventually consolidating the planet under a single name associated with Aphrodite, their goddess of love and beauty. This choice of name, Aphrodite in Greek, and later Venus in Latin, is the one that has survived into the modern era, and it's worth noting how different in character this Greco-Roman naming tradition is from the Mesopotamian one. Where Ishtar carried the weight of war alongside love, Aphrodite and her Roman counterpart Venus were consolidated more purely around beauty, desire, and romantic love, stripped, at least in their most popular later forms, of the martial intensity that had defined Ishtar centuries earlier. It is this gentler, more romantic association, the planet of the love goddess, that would eventually feed into the popular 20th century imagination of Venus as a paradise world, a garden planet, a place where a gentler and more beautiful form of life might plausibly exist, an imaginative thread we will pick back up when we reach the contactee era later in this series. The Roman goddess Venus, from whom the planet takes its modern English name, was in many ways a deliberate political and cultural construction as much as a religious one. The Julian family, the political dynasty that would eventually produce Julius Caesar and the first Roman emperors, claimed direct descent from Venus through the legendary Trojan hero Aeneas, whom Roman mythology held to be the goddess's son. This meant that Venus, and by extension the planet that bore her name, carried an unusually direct connection to imperial legitimacy in Roman culture, a connection that meant temples, festivals, and public monuments to Venus proliferated throughout the Roman world in a way that reinforced both religious devotion and political power simultaneously. The planet's brightness and prominence in the sky made it a natural and convenient symbol for a goddess whose favor an entire ruling dynasty claimed to enjoy. And this Roman naming convention, more than any specific piece of Roman astronomy, is the direct reason the planet is called Venus in English and in most European languages today. Across the Atlantic, in a civilization that had no contact whatsoever with Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, or Rome, the Maya independently developed what may be the single most sophisticated and mathematically precise Venus tracking system in the entire ancient world. The Dresden Codex, one of only a small handful of pre-Columbian Maya manuscripts to survive the destruction of Maya written records during the Spanish conquest, contains an extraordinarily detailed set of tables tracking the synodic cycle of Venus, meaning the roughly 584-day cycle over which Venus appears as a morning star, disappears, appears as an evening star, disappears again, and returns as a morning star. Maya astronomer priests calculated this cycle with an accuracy that modern researchers have confirmed was extremely close to the true value, achieved entirely without telescopes, using nothing but sustained naked-eye observation, carried out over generations, and passed down through a specialized priestly class trained specifically in this kind of long-term astronomical record-keeping. What makes the Maya case particularly striking and particularly relevant to a series about the cultural meaning people have attached to Venus is what they used this precise astronomical knowledge for. Maya inscriptions and the Dresden Codex itself make clear that Venus's cycle was directly tied to warfare. Historians and epigraphers who have studied Maya inscriptions describing military campaigns have found repeated correlations between the timing of recorded attacks and specific points in the Venus cycle, particularly the planet's heliacal rising as a morning star, a moment Maya astronomy associated with danger, aggression, and what has sometimes been translated from surviving glyphs as a kind of ritualized, cosmically sanctioned violence. Some Maya rulers appear to have deliberately timed major military campaigns to coincide with Venus's first appearance as a morning star, a practice that has led some scholars to refer to this period of Maya warfare using the phrase Star Wars, a coincidental echo of modern popular culture that nonetheless captures something real about how central the planet's astronomical cycle was to Maya statecraft. This is a civilization that looked at the same bright point of light the Babylonians and Egyptians had also studied, developed its own entirely independent mathematical system for tracking it, and arrived, independently, at a similar underlying intuition. This light in the sky was connected to conflict, to danger, to consequential and world-altering events on the ground. Venus's association with omens and consequence was not limited to the great literate civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the Maya world. Chinese astronomy, operating within its own long and highly sophisticated observational tradition, referred to Venus using several names across different historical periods, including one that translates roughly to the Great White One or the White Planet, reflecting its brightness, and Chinese astronomers, like their counterparts across the ancient world, integrated Venus into a broader system of celestial omen reading that connected planetary behavior to the fortunes of the emperor and the state. In this tradition, unusual behavior by Venus, an unexpected daytime visibility, an unusual color, and irregular timing of its appearance could be recorded and interpreted by court astronomers as a signal requiring the emperor's attention, sometimes prompting ritual responses intended to correct whatever cosmic imbalance the planet's behavior was thought to indicate. The pattern holds remarkably consistently across cultures that otherwise had no meaningful contact with one another. Wherever careful sky watching developed as an organized practice, Venus tended to be treated not as one star among many, but as a distinct and significant actor, worthy of its own dedicated tracking system and its own body of interpretive lore. It's worth asking, at this point in the story, why Venus specifically attracted this level of attention across so many unrelated cultures, when the night sky contains thousands of visible stars and 5 other planets visible to the naked eye. Part of the answer is simply Venus's extraordinary brightness, which at its peak can be bright enough to cast faint shadows on a clear, dark night, and can occasionally even be spotted during full daylight if an observer knows exactly where to look. A feat essentially impossible with any other planet or star, but brightness alone doesn't fully explain the depth of meaning ancient cultures attached to Venus. Jupiter, after all, is also extremely bright and visible for much longer stretches of the night, yet it did not generate quite the same intensity of omen reading, war timing, and mythological elaboration in most of these traditions. What seems to have mattered specifically about Venus was its behavior, the fact that it disappears and reappears on a predictable but not immediately obvious cycle, switching between a morning and evening presence in a way that requires sustained observation to fully understand, and the fact that, unlike the outer planets, it is never visible in the deep night sky, always confined to the hours near dawn and dusk, the liminal, in-between times of day that many ancient cultures already associated with heightened spiritual significance. The boundary moments between light and darkness, when the ordinary rules of the world were often thought to be more permeable. This liminal quality, the sense that Venus belonged neither fully to the day nor fully to the night, may help explain why so many cultures cast the planet in dual or contradictory roles, simultaneously a bringer of love and a herald of war, simultaneously beautiful and dangerous, simultaneously benevolent and threatening. The Babylonians' Ishtar, the Mayas' war-timing morning star, and even the later Greco-Roman splitting of the planet's gentler qualities from its more intense earlier associations, all seem to reflect an underlying cultural intuition that this particular light in the sky did not sit comfortably in a single simple category. It was too bright, too unpredictable in its timing, and too closely tied to the ambiguous hours of dawn and dusk to be reduced to a single straightforward meaning. This ambiguity, this sense that Venus held some kind of unresolved dual significance, is a thread that runs directly forward into the 20th century contactee narratives, in which Venusians were consistently described as simultaneously otherworldly and reassuringly human-like, simultaneously alien enough to have crossed space in an advanced craft and familiar enough to be described as beautiful by ordinary human standards, a duality that echoes, whether the contactees themselves realized it or not, thousands of years of prior cultural inheritance about what this particular planet was supposed to represent. There is another thread worth pulling out of this ancient material, one that becomes directly relevant when we reach the esoteric and occult traditions of the 19th century in a later part of this series. Several ancient cultures, independently, developed a habit of associating Venus not simply with a deity, but with the idea of a messenger, a being that moved between the world of gods and the world of humans, carrying knowledge, warning, or influence from one realm to the other. The Mesopotamian conception of Ishtar included this messenger-like quality, as did later Greco-Roman ideas about Venus's connection to guidance and revelation. This idea that the light seen near dawn and dusk represented some kind of intermediary presence, moving between a higher realm and the human world, carrying knowledge that human beings could not access on their own, is a strikingly direct ancestor of the 20th century idea that Venus was inhabited by a spiritually advanced race in contact with Earth, offering guidance that human civilization needed but could not generate for itself. When George Adamski described Orthon in 1952 as a being of unusual serenity and wisdom, concerned about humanity's future and eager to offer guidance, he was, whether consciously or not, echoing a role that Venus had been assigned in human storytelling for well over 3,000 years before he ever walked out into that California desert. It's also worth noting briefly how Venus was treated in traditions outside the major astronomical civilizations we've discussed so far, because the pattern holds up remarkably well even in cultures with very different religious and cosmological frameworks. In parts of pre-Columbian North America, separate from the Maya astronomical tradition, some indigenous groups developed their own observational relationships with Venus, incorporating its cycle into ceremonial calendars and oral traditions, describing it as a powerful, sometimes dangerous, celestial figure. In parts of Polynesia, where extraordinarily sophisticated naked-eye navigation techniques depended on precise knowledge of star and planet positions, Venus served a more practical role as a navigational reference point, though even here it often carried additional layers of ceremonial or mythological significance beyond its purely functional use in wayfinding. The consistency of this pattern, ancient cultures across entirely separate continents with no contact with one another, independently singling out Venus for special attention, special naming, and special mythological elaboration, is not evidence of any actual extraterrestrial visitation in the ancient past, a claim made by a different and much later school of speculative thought that lies outside the scope of this particular series. Rather, it's evidence of something more grounded and, in its own way, just as remarkable: that human beings, everywhere, looking up at the same physical object with the same basic set of senses, tend to notice the same things and draw broadly similar conclusions from them, which is exactly what you would expect if the underlying pattern being noticed, Venus's brightness, its dual morning and evening appearances, its confinement to the hours around dawn and dusk, is a real, physical, and universally observable feature of the sky, rather than a culturally specific invention. By the time organized astronomy began to develop the mathematical tools to actually calculate planetary orbits with precision, rather than simply track their appearances empirically, Venus had already accumulated thousands of years of layered mythological meaning across virtually every literate civilization on Earth. It had been a goddess of war and a goddess of love. It had been a signal for kings to launch military campaigns, and a symbol claimed by an entire imperial dynasty as proof of its own divine legitimacy. It had been tracked with mathematical precision by priests who had no concept of a planet in the modern sense, who nonetheless produced astronomical calculations accurate enough that scholars still use them today to help calibrate ancient chronologies. And running through nearly all of these traditions was a persistent undercurrent, sometimes explicit and sometimes only implied, that this particular light represented something more than an inert astronomical object, that it carried meaning, intention, and perhaps even a kind of presence, watching from its position near the horizon during the ambiguous hours of dawn and dusk. None of the ancient astronomer priests who tracked Venus across Babylonian, Egyptian, Greek, Roman, Maya, or Chinese skies had any conception of it as a physical world, a sphere of rock and cloud orbiting the sun at a specific measurable distance, subject to the same physical laws as the earth beneath their feet. That understanding would not begin to take shape until the invention of the telescope, an instrument that would, for the first time in human history, allow observers to move Venus from the category of divine symbol into the category of physical place, a planet with a surface, an atmosphere, and, as astronomers would spend the following 3 centuries debating without ever quite resolving it, possibly even inhabitants of its own. That transition from Venus the goddess to Venus the world, from ancient omen to scientific mystery, is where our story picks up next, and it is where the modern legend of the Venusians truly begins to take its recognizable shape. The telescope era, canals, clouds, and the jungle planet. When Galileo Galilei turned his telescope toward Venus in the autumn of 1610, he was not looking for life, he was looking for proof. At the time, the great debate in European astronomy was not about who lived where in the solar system, but about the solar system's basic architecture, whether the Earth stood still at the center of everything while the sun and planets revolved around it, as the Church and centuries of tradition insisted, or whether the Earth itself was just another planet, orbiting the sun alongside its neighbors, as Copernicus had proposed decades earlier, and as Galileo himself increasingly believed. Venus, it turned out, held the answer. Galileo observed that Venus went through a full cycle of phases, from a thin crescent to a nearly full disk and back again, exactly as the moon does, a pattern that could only be explained if Venus orbited the sun rather than the Earth. It was one of the most important single observations in the entire history of astronomy, and it happened to involve the same bright object that Babylonian priests and Maya astronomers had already been tracking for thousands of years, now revealed for the first time, not as a symbol or an omen, but as a physical sphere, catching and reflecting sunlight exactly as a solid, three-dimensional world would be expected to do. What Galileo could not do, and what no telescope on Earth would ever manage to do, was see anything beyond that reflective, featureless disk. Venus, through even the most powerful telescopes of the following 3.5 centuries, presented observers with almost nothing to look at beyond a bright, blank, cloud-covered sphere. This absence of detail was, in its own way, more provocative to the scientific imagination than almost anything a telescope could have actually shown. Mars, over the same centuries, gradually revealed polar ice caps, dark surface markings that shifted with the seasons, and eventually the famous and ultimately mistaken canals that so captured the public imagination in the late 19th century. The moon revealed its entire cratered face in exhaustive detail, almost from the moment telescopes were first pointed at it. Jupiter revealed its banded clouds and its 4 largest moons. Within the same year, Galileo first observed Venus's phases. But Venus, the planet closest to Earth, the planet most similar to Earth in size, gave up nothing. It kept its surface permanently hidden, and that persistent, frustrating blankness became, over time, a kind of empty canvas onto which generations of astronomers, and eventually the general public, projected their own theories about what must be hiding underneath. The first serious scientific clue that something significant was happening on Venus beyond its bright, featureless appearance came not from a telescope pointed at the planet in its ordinary phases, but from a rare astronomical event that occurs in pairs roughly once a century, the transit of Venus, in which the planet passes directly between the Earth and the Sun, appearing as a small, dark dot slowly crossing the Sun's bright face. These transits were of enormous scientific importance in the 18th century for a completely different reason than the one that concerns this series, since careful timing of transits from multiple locations around the globe allowed astronomers to calculate, with reasonable precision for the first time, the actual distance between the Earth and the Sun, a fundamental measurement that had eluded astronomers for centuries. Expeditions were mounted at enormous expense and considerable personal risk to observe the transits of 1761 and 1769 from remote locations around the world, in one of the first truly international scientific collaborations in history. But during the 1761 transit, observers noticed something unexpected and, at the time, difficult to explain. As Venus's disk began to cross onto the Sun, and again as it prepared to leave, observers in several different locations independently reported seeing a faint, glowing ring of light around the portion of Venus's disk that had not yet moved onto the Sun's face, an effect that became known as the black drop effect in some contexts and, more importantly for our purposes, was correctly interpreted by the Russian polymath Mikhail Lomonosov as evidence that Venus possessed a substantial atmosphere. Lomonosov's reasoning was sound and has held up well under modern scrutiny. A planet with no atmosphere at all should present a perfectly sharp, dark silhouette during a transit, but the faint aura of light Lomonosov and other observers described could only be explained by sunlight refracting through a layer of gas surrounding the planet, bending around its edge in a way that revealed the presence of an atmosphere, even though the atmosphere itself could not be directly seen or analyzed with the instruments available at the time. This was, in a real sense, the first true piece of physical evidence, obtained through careful observation and correct physical reasoning rather than mythology or speculation, that Venus was not simply a lifeless reflective ball, but a world wrapped in something, a world with weather, in some sense, a world that might, at least in principle, support conditions compatible with life. Once the existence of a Venusian atmosphere had been established, astronomical speculation accelerated rapidly, and it did so in a specific and important context, the The late 18th and 19th centuries were a period during which many of the most respected scientific minds in Europe took the plausibility of life on other planets extremely seriously, not as science fiction, but as sober scientific hypothesis. William Herschel, the astronomer who discovered the planet Uranus and one of the most respected observers of his era, speculated openly and in published work about the likelihood of life existing throughout the solar system, reasoning that a universe governed by consistent physical laws and populated with numerous planets bearing atmospheres and other Earth-like characteristics would seem an extraordinary waste if Earth alone among all these worlds happened to host living beings. This was not a fringe position. It was, for a significant stretch of the 19th century, closer to the scientific mainstream than the alternative, and Venus, as the planet most similar to Earth in size, and the planet definitively known to possess an atmosphere, was a natural focus for this kind of speculation. As telescope technology continued to improve throughout the 19th century, a small number of observers reported seeing faint, indistinct markings on Venus's cloud tops, shadowy patterns that some interpreted as evidence of surface features showing through gaps in the atmosphere, and occasionally as something more structured and deliberate, echoing, in a smaller and less publicized way, the far more famous and ultimately discredited claims of artificial canals on Mars that captured global attention in the same era. These Venusian markings never achieved anything like the cultural impact of the Martian Canal controversy, in large part because Venus's cloud cover was so much more complete and so much more consistent than Mars's atmosphere, making any claimed surface detail far more tenuous and far more difficult for other observers to reliably confirm. Most of the astronomers who reported these markings on Venus were, in hindsight, almost certainly observing subtle optical effects within their own telescopes, artifacts of imperfect lenses, and the physiological tendency of the human eye and brain to perceive patterns and structure even in genuinely random or ambiguous visual information, a phenomenon well understood today but poorly appreciated by many well-meaning 19th century observers working at the very limits of what their instruments could reliably show them. It was in this atmosphere of genuine scientific uncertainty, an atmosphere in which respected astronomers had established that Venus possessed a substantial atmosphere but had no way to determine what that atmosphere was made of, what temperature existed beneath it, or what if anything existed on the surface it concealed, that one of the most influential and consequential scientific hypotheses in the entire history of Venusian speculation took shape. In 1918, the Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius, a Nobel laureate and one of the most respected scientists of his generation, published a book proposing a detailed physical picture of conditions on Venus, and it is difficult to overstate how much influence this single work would go on to have over the following 4 decades of both scientific and popular thinking about the planet. Arrhenius reasoned that Venus's thick cloud cover almost certainly indicated an extremely humid atmosphere, and combined with the planet's closer proximity to the Sun compared to Earth, he concluded that Venus was likely warmer and wetter than our own world, its surface probably dominated by extensive swamps, shallow seas, and dense, moisture-loving vegetation, an environment he explicitly compared to Earth's own Carboniferous period, the geological era hundreds of millions of years in Earth's past when much of our planet was covered in humid coal-forming swamps, giant ferns, and primitive amphibian life long before the rise of dinosaurs, let alone mammals or anything resembling intelligent life. Arrhenius's hypothesis, sometimes referred to since as the Swamp Venus model, was not a fringe speculation dismissed by his scientific contemporaries. It was, for its time, a genuinely reasonable extrapolation from the best available evidence, published by a scientist with an impeccable professional reputation, and it was taken seriously and built upon by other astronomers throughout the following decades. The idea proved enormously appealing for reasons that go beyond pure scientific reasoning. It offered a strangely comforting picture of Venus, not as an alien and unknowable world, but as a kind of preserved snapshot of Earth's own distant evolutionary past, a living laboratory where a visitor might, in principle, observe firsthand what Earth itself had looked like hundreds of millions of years earlier. This framing of Venus as Earth's past rather than Earth's opposite made the idea of Venusian life feel intuitive and almost familiar rather than exotic, and it set the stage for a particular flavor of imagined Venusian life that would dominate both scientific speculation and popular fiction for the following several decades. Not advanced human-like civilizations at first, but primitive primeval ecosystems, dense jungles, giant ferns, perhaps amphibious or reptilian creatures analogous to Earth's own Carboniferous and later dinosaur-era fauna. Other astronomers of the early 20th century built on and modified Arrhenius's basic picture in various ways. Some proposed that Venus's surface might be entirely covered by a planet-wide ocean, its clouds simply the product of constant evaporation from that vast body of water. A model sometimes called the Ocean-Venus hypothesis, distinct from but closely related to the swamp model. Others speculated about a Venus covered largely in dust and sandstorms, its clouds composed not of water vapor, but of fine wind-blown particulate matter kicked up by a windswept arid surface. An early and less popular alternative model that, remarkably, would turn out decades later to be considerably closer to certain aspects of Venus's actual atmospheric behavior than the more popular swamp or ocean models, even though the reasoning behind it was largely coincidental rather than well-founded. The important point is not which specific model turned out to be closest to the truth, since none of them anticipated the true and far stranger reality that spacecraft would eventually reveal, but rather that throughout the first half of the 20th century, the scientific community had no consensus and no way to resolve the question, and in that vacuum, multiple serious, professionally credentialed models of a warm, wet, potentially life-supporting Venus circulated simultaneously in respectable scientific literature. The development of a new observational technique in the early 20th century, spectroscopy, which allows astronomers to analyze the specific wavelengths of light reflected or absorbed by a planet's atmosphere and thereby determine its chemical composition, promised finally to settle these competing hypotheses with hard data rather than educated guesswork. And in 1932, astronomers Walter Adams and Theodore Dunham, using spectroscopic analysis at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California, detected the presence of large quantities of carbon dioxide in Venus's atmosphere, the first time any specific chemical component of that atmosphere had been directly identified rather than merely inferred. This finding should, in retrospect, have been the first serious blow to the swamp Venus hypothesis, since an atmosphere dominated by carbon dioxide is not obviously compatible with a lush, jungle-like, oxygen-breathing ecosystem of the kind Arrhenius and others had envisioned. But the full implications of a carbon dioxide-dominated atmosphere, specifically its connection to what scientists would later come to understand as the greenhouse effect, an atmospheric process by which certain gases trap heat and dramatically raise a planet's surface temperature beyond what sunlight alone would produce, were not yet properly understood in the 1930s. The physics of the greenhouse effect existed in a rudimentary form in scientific literature dating back to the 19th century, associated with early researchers investigating Earth's own climate, but its application to Venus and the recognition of just how extreme and runaway that effect could become on a planet with an atmosphere as thick and carbon dioxide rich as Venus's would not be worked out with any precision until measurements from actual spacecraft became available decades later. In the meantime, the detection of carbon dioxide was interpreted by many astronomers not as evidence against habitability, but simply as one more data point to be incorporated into an already crowded field of competing models, most of which still allowed, in one form or another, for the possibility of a warm, wet, and at least potentially life-bearing surface hidden beneath those clouds. Radio astronomy, developing rapidly in the years following the Second World War, added another layer of data and another layer of confusion to the puzzle. Early radio observations of Venus in the 1950s produced measurements suggesting the planet's surface, or at least the source of the radio emissions being detected, was extremely hot, considerably hotter than any of the swamp or ocean models had predicted. But these findings were initially controversial and difficult to interpret with confidence, since scientists could not yet be entirely certain whether the radio signals were coming from Venus's actual solid surface, from some layer within its atmosphere, or from some other poorly understood physical process altogether. Some astronomers propose that the radio data might be explained by an electrically charged layer high in Venus's atmosphere, similar to Earth's own ionosphere, rather than reflecting genuine surface heat, a proposal that, if correct, would have preserved the possibility of a temperate, habitable surface underneath. Other researchers argued more directly, and as it would turn out, more correctly, that the data indicated a genuinely scorching surface temperature, a position that remained a minority view among the wider public and even among some scientists throughout the 1950s, precisely because it was so difficult to reconcile with everything Venus's size, distance from the Sun, and general Earth-like characteristics had seemed to suggest for the previous 3 centuries of telescopic observation. This scientific uncertainty, real, ongoing, and unresolved, filtered out into popular culture throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s in a way that is important to understand clearly because it directly shaped the intellectual environment into which the contactee claims would soon emerge. Popular science magazines, newspaper science sections, and general interest publications like Life and Time regularly ran articles describing Venus in terms drawn directly from the swamp and ocean hypotheses, illustrated with speculative artist renderings of dense jungles, giant prehistoric-looking plants, misty swamps, and occasionally primitive amphibian or reptilian creatures, all presented not as fantasy, but as a reasonable, scientifically grounded picture of what a spacecraft might eventually find if it ever managed to descend through Venus's clouds. These articles were not written by cranks or hoaxers. They were, in many cases, written by working science journalists summarizing genuine, currently active scientific debate, citing real astronomers and real published research. An ordinary, reasonably well-informed reader of a mainstream magazine in 1948 or 1950 would have had every reason to believe that Venus was very likely a warm, wet, possibly jungle-covered world, quite possibly capable of supporting some form of life, because that is roughly what the most visible and widely reported scientific speculation of the era was telling them. This is the crucial context that makes the emergence of the Venusian contactee movement, which we will examine in close detail beginning in the next several parts of this series, considerably less strange and considerably more explicable than it might otherwise appear from a modern vantage point, looking back with the full benefit of decades of spacecraft data that definitively settled the question. When George Adamski and the contactees who followed him described meeting beings from a warm, habitable Venus, they were not asking their audiences to believe something that contradicted the science of their day. They were, in a very real sense, extending a genuinely open scientific question to its next logical step. If serious astronomers were willing to publish detailed speculation about Venusian swamps and jungles and possible primitive life, the additional claim that this hospitable environment might have given rise not merely to plants and amphibians, but to an advanced human-like civilization, while certainly a much larger leap, did not require the contactees' audiences to reject established scientific consensus, because no such settled consensus about Venus's surface conditions actually existed yet. The clouds had not parted. The mystery Galileo's telescope first revealed in 1610, a bright, blank, uncooperative disk, giving up none of its secrets, remained fully intact 340 years later, and it was within that persistent, genuine, scientifically sanctioned uncertainty that the most extraordinary claims about Venusian life would soon take root, not in the halls of astronomy, but in the imagination of science fiction writers, pulp magazine illustrators, and eventually, in the words of the contactees themselves, standing in the American desert in the early 1950s, describing a meeting with a visitor who claimed to be a native of the very world the telescopes could never quite reveal. Science fiction primes the public mind. Scientific speculation about a warm, wet, possibly life-bearing Venus did not stay confined to observatories and academic journals. It traveled, and one of the main vehicles that carried it into the wider public imagination was a body of popular fiction that, in the first half of the 20th century, was consumed by an enormous cross-section of the American and European public, the pulp magazine. cheaply printed, sold on newsstands for a few cents an issue, and produced at a furious pace by writers who were often paid by the word. Pulp science fiction magazines of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s did more than entertain. They built, issue by issue, cover illustration by cover illustration, a shared visual and narrative vocabulary for what the other planets of the solar system were supposed to look like. And Venus, thanks to the ongoing scientific uncertainty we covered in the previous part of this series, became one of the genre's favorite and most reliably profitable settings. The pulp magazines drew directly and explicitly on the swamp Venus hypothesis and its close cousins, the ocean Venus and jungle Venus models that were circulating in respectable scientific literature and popular science journalism throughout this period. Because no telescope could see through Venus's clouds, and because credentialed scientists themselves were actively speculating about dense vegetation, warm seas, and primitive life forms, science fiction writers had, in effect, been handed a license to imagine almost anything they wanted, so long as it fit broadly within the humid, prehistoric-feeling template the scientific speculation had already established. This was a very different creative situation than writing about, say, the moon, whose barren, airless, cratered surface had already been observed in exhaustive telescopic detail and left correspondingly little room for imaginative embellishment. Venus, hidden behind its clouds, was a blank canvas that came with an official-sounding scientific justification for filling it with jungles, monsters, and eventually, civilizations. Edgar Rice Burroughs, already immensely famous by the 1930s as the creator of Tarzan and of the popular Barsoom series of novels set on Mars, turned his attention to Venus with a series of adventure novels beginning with a book published in installments starting in 1932, featuring a human protagonist named Carson Napier who travels to Venus, a planet Burroughs's novels called Amtor, and finds it populated by a wildly varied assortment of civilizations, monsters, and environments, ranging from primitive tribal societies to sophisticated cities, all set against a backdrop of dense jungles, warm seas, and the kind of perpetual cloud cover that matched the scientific understanding of the day. Burroughs's Venus novels were enormously popular, reaching a wide audience that extended well beyond the dedicated readership of science fiction pulp magazines, and they did important cultural work in normalizing the idea for a mass audience that Venus was not simply an empty, alien world, but a fully realized planet capable of hosting complex societies, diverse peoples, and dramatic human-scale adventure, an idea that would resurface in a very different and far more consequential form 2 decades later, when the contactees began describing their own encounters with Venusian visitors. Burroughs was far from alone in setting adventure fiction on Venus during this period. Otis Adelbert Klein, a prolific pulp writer often positioned, somewhat unfairly, as Burroughs's chief rival in the planetary romance genre, wrote his own series of Venus-set adventures in the same general period, similarly populating the planet with warm jungles, exotic civilizations, and dramatic conflicts between human visitors and native Venusian societies. Stanley G. Weinbaum, whose short career in science fiction cut tragically short by his early death in 1935, nonetheless produced some of the genre's most influential and, by the standards of the time, scientifically thoughtful work, wrote several stories set on Venus, including tales that explored the planet's dense, swampy ecosystems with an attention to internally consistent biology and ecology that was considered unusually sophisticated for pulp fiction of that era, work that science fiction historians still cite today as an important step toward more scientifically grounded speculative fiction, distinct from the more purely adventure-driven planetary romances of Burroughs and Klein. It's worth pausing to notice something important about the specific flavor of Venus that emerged across this body of 1930s and 1940s fiction, because it differs in a telling way from how Mars was typically portrayed in the same era. Mars fiction, following the lead of astronomer Percival Lowell's famous and ultimately mistaken claims about artificial canals crisscrossing the Martian surface, tended to emphasize an old, dying civilization, ancient cities, a planet past its prime, its inhabitants sophisticated but often decadent or fading, engaged in a losing struggle against a drying, dying world. Venus fiction, by contrast, consistently leaned toward the primeval and the fecund, rather than the ancient and the declining. Venus was young where Mars was old. Venus was wet, humid, and overgrown, where Mars was dry, dusty, and depleted. Venus was a planet of beginnings, of primitive or newly emerging life, sometimes dangerous and monstrous, sometimes primitive but noble, while Mars was consistently imagined as a planet of endings. This distinction matters because it reveals just how directly science fiction of this period was tracking the actual, contemporaneous scientific speculation about each planet, Lowell's canals and dying civilization theories for Mars, Arrhenius's swamp and jungle theories for Venus, and translating that speculation into narrative and visual terms that reached a vastly larger audience than the original scientific papers or even the science journalism ever could. Visual art played just as important a role as the written fiction itself in shaping public imagination during this period, and in some ways an even more important one, since a striking cover illustration could shape a potential reader's expectations before they had read a single word of the story inside. Pulp magazine cover artists, working under tight deadlines for publishers who understood that a dramatic cover sold copies on a crowded newsstand far more effectively than any amount of text, developed a recognizable visual shorthand for Venus that recurred across dozens of different magazines and hundreds of different covers throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Dense, oversized ferns and fungoid vegetation, dripping humidity rendered in thick greens and sickly yellows, swamps shrouded in mist, and, very often, a human adventurer, frequently accompanied by a woman in some state of peril, confronting an outsized reptilian or amphibian monster rising up out of the muck. This visual template, repeated so often across so many different artists and publications that it effectively became a genre convention in its own right, did enormously effective work in cementing a specific, consistent mental image of Venus in the minds of a huge segment of the reading public, an image that existed and circulated widely years before any spacecraft could confirm or deny a single detail of it. Radio drama, still an enormously popular and influential medium throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, extended the same imaginative work into an even wider audience, including listeners who might never have picked up a pulp magazine at a newsstand. Serialized science fiction adventure programs, along with radio adaptations of popular comic strip characters, regularly sent their heroes to Venus and other planets, describing exotic alien landscapes and civilizations purely through sound, dialogue, and the listener's own imagination, a medium that in some ways demanded even more active participation from its audience in constructing a mental picture of what these worlds actually looked like. The broader cultural moment of radio science fiction is perhaps best remembered today for a single, famous incident that did not involve Venus at all: the 1938 radio adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, presented in a documentary-style news bulletin format that reportedly caused genuine, if now somewhat exaggerated in popular retelling, alarm among some listeners who believed an actual Martian invasion was underway. That incident is worth mentioning here, not because it involved Venus, since Wells's original novel and its radio adaptation concerned an invasion from Mars, but because it demonstrates something important and directly relevant to our broader story. By the late 1930s, the American public had been so thoroughly primed by more than a decade of science fiction depicting visitors from other planets that a significant number of ordinary listeners found it entirely plausible, at least for the duration of a tense radio broadcast, that beings from another world might actually be arriving on Earth. That same cultural readiness, that same willingness to entertain the idea of extraterrestrial visitors as a live possibility rather than pure fantasy would prove directly relevant just over a decade later when the first Venusian contactees began making their claims. Comic strips extended this same imaginative work to an even younger and broader audience through the daily newspaper. Buck Rogers, which began as a comic strip in 1929 before expanding into radio, film serials, and a wide range of licensed merchandise, and Flash Gordon, which followed a similar trajectory beginning in 1934. Both featured extensive storylines set on Venus, among other planets. depicting the planet with the same general visual and narrative conventions established in the pulp magazines: dense jungles, exotic and often dangerous native life, and opportunities for dramatic human-alien encounter and conflict. These strips reached readers of every age, in every region of the country, through ordinary daily newspapers rather than specialty science fiction magazines, meaning that even people who never considered themselves science fiction fans in any formal sense absorbed, simply through casual daily newspaper reading over years of serialized storylines, a basic mental template of what Venus was supposed to be: a wild, dangerous, jungle-covered world, plausible enough to serve as the backdrop for ongoing adventure stories that millions of ordinary readers followed with genuine engagement week after week. Film added yet another layer to this cultural saturation, though somewhat later and less extensively during this particular period than radio, print fiction, and comic strips, with the science fiction film industry not truly hitting its stride in terms of scale and special effects until the 1950s, a period that would overlap directly with the emergence of the contactee movement itself, and that we will touch on again later in this series when we discuss how popular culture and the contactee phenomenon fed back into one another during that decade. But even in the earlier period, we're focused on, in this part, serialized film adventures, modeled closely on the Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon comic strip properties, brought broadly similar Venusian imagery to movie theater audiences, reinforcing through yet another medium the same basic cultural picture that print fiction and radio drama had already established. By the time the Second World War ended and the atomic age began in earnest, in other words, an enormous cross-section of the American public, and to a significant extent audiences in Britain and other countries where these publications and broadcasts also circulated widely, had already spent roughly 2 full decades absorbing a remarkably consistent set of ideas about Venus through popular entertainment: that it was a warm, humid, jungle-covered world, quite possibly dangerous, quite possibly inhabited by strange creatures, or even, in some of the more sophisticated planetary romance fiction, by genuinely civilized societies capable of complex culture and diplomacy with human visitors. This popular cultural understanding ran directly parallel to, and drew directly upon, the genuine scientific uncertainty and speculation about Venus's true surface conditions that we described in the previous part of this series. Crucially, for most ordinary readers and listeners, the line between what serious astronomers were speculating in respectable journals and popular magazines and what pulp fiction writers were imagining in their adventure stories was not always sharply drawn in everyday public consciousness. Both streams of information reinforced and echoed one another: science journalism describing possible Venusian swamps and primitive life in language not drastically different from the fiction, and the fiction citing, sometimes explicitly in authors' notes or introductory passages, the actual scientific speculation of the day as justification for its imaginative content. This decades-long process of cultural priming matters enormously for understanding what happened next, and it is important to state clearly, without exaggeration, exactly what role it played. None of this pulp fiction, radio drama, or comic strip material directly caused the emergence of the Venusian contactee movement in the way that a single traceable influence might cause a single traceable effect. George Adamski and the contactees who followed him did not simply repackage Buck Rogers' storylines and present them as true accounts, and it would be a significant oversimplification to suggest otherwise. But what this decades-long saturation of popular culture with the image of an inhabited, jungle-covered, or at least habitable Venus did accomplish, and accomplish very thoroughly, was to establish a deep, widely shared, and largely unquestioned cultural background assumption that Venus, more than any other planet in the solar system, was the single most plausible candidate for a nearby, potentially inhabited world. When Adamski stood up in 1952 and described meeting a being who identified himself as coming from Venus, he was not asking his audience to accept an entirely novel or outlandish idea invented from nothing. He was making a claim that slotted neatly into an existing, deeply familiar cultural framework that millions of ordinary Americans had already absorbed through science journalism, through pulp magazines, through radio dramas, through daily newspaper comic strips over the course of more than 2 decades. The soil had already been prepared, thoroughly and by many different hands, long before the first seed of the contactee movement was ever planted. There is one more thread from this period worth tracing before we move into the contactee era itself, because it connects the world of popular fiction directly to the more mystical and esoteric tradition we will examine in detail in a later part of this series. A number of science fiction and fantasy writers working in the first half of the 20th century were themselves personally involved in, or at least significantly influenced by, occult and esoteric movements, and their fiction sometimes carried, whether overtly or in more disguised form, ideas drawn directly from that esoteric tradition's own long-standing claims about Venus as a spiritually advanced world. This overlap between popular genre fiction and serious occult belief was not always visible to ordinary readers, who typically approached these stories simply as entertainment, but it meant that by the time the contactee movement emerged in the early 1950s, there already existed a well-established, if largely unacknowledged, channel connecting esoteric spiritual teachings about an advanced Venusian civilization to the broader popular culture through the medium of speculative fiction. We will return to this esoteric tradition in full in a later part of this series, tracing it back to its own separate 19th century origins in the Theosophical movement, because understanding it properly requires setting aside the science fiction and scientific speculation covered in this part and the previous one, and looking instead at a very different kind of source material altogether. Not astronomy and adventure fiction, but channeled spiritual teaching, claimed contact with ascended masters, and a cosmology in which Venus held a position of genuine religious significance decades before any contactee ever walked out into the California desert. For now, though, our story moves forward chronologically into the years immediately following the Second World War, when the cultural groundwork we have just described, decades of scientific speculation about a warm and possibly inhabited Venus, decades of popular fiction depicting Venusian jungles, monsters, and civilizations, and a newly awakened, atomic age public anxiety about humanity's own capacity for self-destruction all converged at once. Into that specific and unusually receptive moment stepped an amateur astronomer and self-styled philosopher from California, who would claim, in the autumn of 1952, to have walked out into the desert and met, face to face, a visitor who told him he had come from the very planet that science, fiction, and popular imagination had spent decades preparing the public to believe might, after all, be inhabited. George Adamski and the Meeting with Orthon. Before November of 1952, George Adamski was already a known figure in a small, informal circle of amateur astronomers and spiritual seekers scattered across Southern California, though he was known there for reasons that had relatively little to do with rigorous science. Born in Poland in 1891 and raised from early childhood in the United States, Adamski had spent much of his adult life moving between various occupations and, by his own later accounts, various forms of spiritual and philosophical study, eventually settling near Mount Palomar in California, a location whose name would later cause considerable public confusion since it sits near, but is entirely separate from, the famous Palomar Observatory, home to one of the largest and most important professional telescopes in the world. Adamski ran a small business and modest cafe near the mountain, and it was there, using a comparatively small amateur telescope of his own, that he had for some years already been taking photographs of the sky, and, according to his own claims made even before 1952, occasionally photographing what he described as unidentified craft. Some later profiles and critical investigations of Adamski would note that his use of the Palomar name in his subsequent writings, and the way some readers and journalists conflated his amateur operation with the prestigious professional observatory located nearby, lent his early claims a degree of unearned scientific credibility in the public mind, a confusion Adamski did not go out of his way to correct. The event that would transform Adamski from a locally known figure with an interest in flying saucers into an internationally famous public personality took place, according to his own detailed account, on the 20th of November, 1952, in the California desert near Desert Center, not far from the town of Parker, Arizona, close to the California border. Adamski described driving out into the desert that day, accompanied by several companions, including his secretary Lucy McGinnis and a married couple, George and Betty Bailey, along with several others who joined the group over the course of the day after word spread that unusual aerial activity had reportedly already been sighted in the area that morning. According to Adamski's account, and according to signed statements later provided by several of these companions and included in his subsequent book, the group observed what they described as a large, cigar-shaped craft high in the sky, and Adamski, believing based on some prior intuition or instinct that this was the moment he had been waiting for, asked his companions to drive him a short distance further into the desert alone, where he set up his telescope and camera equipment and waited. What Adamski claimed happened next became, over the following years, one of the most widely read and most consequential accounts in the entire history of the UFO phenomenon. He described seeing a smaller craft, a scout ship as he called it, descend from the larger cigar-shaped mothership and land in a nearby ravine, out of sight of his waiting companions, who remained a considerable distance away and, by Adamski's own account, were too far off to see clearly what happened next, though several of them later stated they observed the craft itself from a distance through binoculars. Adamski described walking toward the landed scout craft and, as he approached, encountering a human figure emerging from between two nearby hills. A man, as Adamski described him, of medium height, with unusually long, flowing blonde hair, a high forehead, and what Adamski repeatedly emphasized in his later writing and lectures was an extraordinarily gentle, serene, almost luminous quality to his face and bearing, unlike any expression Adamski said he had ever seen on an ordinary human being. Adamski described the being as wearing a close-fitting one-piece garment, brownish in color, and stated that despite the being's evidently non-English-speaking origin, the two were able to communicate through a combination of telepathy, simple hand gestures, and a kind of intuitive mutual understanding that Adamski struggled, in his own account, to fully put into words for his readers. According to Adamski, this meeting lasted a significant period of time, during which the being, through the communication methods just described, conveyed a message of concern about humanity's development and use of atomic weapons, expressing what Adamski characterized as a benevolent, almost parental worry on the part of the being and those he represented about the potential for humanity to destroy itself, along with a broader message emphasizing cosmic brotherhood, spiritual development, and the idea that human beings on Earth were part of a much larger community of intelligent life spread throughout the universe, a community that was, in this telling, quietly watching Earth's progress with a mixture of hope and concern. At some point during this encounter, according to Adamski, the being indicated through gesture that he came from the planet Venus. Adamski later named the being Orthon in his subsequent writing, though he stated that this name was one he attributed to the visitor for the convenience of his readers and his own later reference, since the being's actual method of self-identification during the encounter itself had been largely nonverbal. Adamski claimed that during this same encounter, he was permitted to examine, and in some accounts briefly handle, a small tape recorder or device the being carried, and that he later found, in the exact spot where the being had stood, a clear footprint bearing what Adamski described as unusual symbols pressed into the desert sand, a footprint he made a plaster cast of and later reproduced as an illustration in his published account. He also claimed to have taken several photographs of the scout craft, both before and after the personal encounter, images that would go on to become some of the most widely reproduced and most heavily scrutinized photographs in the entire history of UFO literature, showing what appears in the images to be a domed, saucer-shaped craft with a distinctive arrangement of spherical protrusions along its lower rim. The 6 companions who had remained behind during Adamski's personal encounter, or who had otherwise been present in the general area that day, later provided signed, notarized affidavits attesting to various aspects of what they had independently observed, including the presence of the craft in the sky, Adamski's absence for a period of time consistent with his account of the personal meeting, and, in some cases, more limited direct observations of what appeared to be an unusual craft or a figure at a distance. These affidavits were reproduced in full in Adamski's subsequent book, and were, at the time and in later years, presented by Adamski's supporters as important corroborating evidence that something genuinely unusual had occurred that day, since it was not merely Adamski's own uncorroborated word being offered to the public, but a set of independent statements from named individuals willing to attach their signatures to a formal account. Critics and later investigators, however, pointed out that none of Adamski's companions actually witnessed the central and most extraordinary claim itself, the direct personal meeting and communication with the being Adamski called Orthon, since by Adamski's own account, that portion of the encounter took place while he was alone, out of sight of the rest of the group, meaning the affidavits, however sincerely offered, corroborated only the more mundane and ambiguous portions of the day's events, not the specific claim of contact with a Venusian visitor that made the story internationally famous. The full account of this encounter, along with Adamski's broader philosophy about cosmic brotherhood, planetary evolution, and the concerns of what he described as a confederation of civilizations from Venus, Mars, Saturn, and other worlds monitoring Earth's development, was published in 1953 in a book titled Flying Saucers Have Landed, co-authored with the British writer and UFO researcher Desmond Leslie, whose contribution comprised the book's first half, focused on the history and broader theoretical framework of the UFO phenomenon as Leslie understood it, while Adamski's own contribution, comprising the second half of the book, presented his personal account of the November 1952 desert encounter, along with his broader claims about the nature and mission of the visitors he said were monitoring Earth. The book became an immediate and substantial international bestseller, translated into numerous languages and reprinted repeatedly over the following years, making Adamski, almost overnight, one of the most famous and most recognizable figures associated with the entire UFO phenomenon anywhere in the world, a position he would hold, for better and for worse, for the remainder of his life. Adamski did not stop with a single claimed encounter. In the years following the publication of Flying Saucers Have Landed, he claimed a series of further contacts and experiences, culminating in claims of being taken aboard Venusian and other extraterrestrial craft traveling within the solar system, and even, in his most expansive later claims, being shown views of the far side of the moon before any human spacecraft had photographed it, along with detailed descriptions of what he described as the true inhabited nature of Venus, Mars, and Saturn, worlds he described as home to advanced, spiritually developed civilizations living in harmony with their environments, a picture that stood in direct contrast to what actual space probes would, within less than a decade, reveal about the genuinely hostile physical conditions on at least two of those worlds. These further claims were published in a second book, Inside the Spaceships, released in 1955, which expanded considerably on the cosmological and philosophical framework only briefly sketched in the first book, describing a kind of spiritual hierarchy of inhabited worlds throughout the solar system and beyond, with Earth positioned, in Adamski's telling, as a comparatively young and spiritually undeveloped member of this cosmic community, still prone to war and materialism in a way the more advanced Venusians and others had long since outgrown. Adamski's claims and his personal charisma as a lecturer and public speaker earned him a devoted following that extended well beyond the United States, and he undertook lecture tours in Europe, during which he reportedly drew large and enthusiastic crowds, along with at least one claimed private audience with Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, a meeting Adamski's supporters cited as evidence of his growing legitimacy and respectability, though the exact nature and significance of that meeting remained, like much surrounding Adamski, a matter of dispute between his supporters and his critics. Within the broader and rapidly growing UFO research community of the 1950s, however, Adamski's claims proved deeply and permanently divisive from a remarkably early stage, establishing a fracture within the field that would persist in various forms for decades afterward. A significant number of researchers who took the broader phenomenon of unidentified aerial sightings seriously and who believed that at least some portion of the era's UFO reports likely reflected genuine, unexplained aerial phenomena worthy of serious investigation, nonetheless regarded Adamski's specific personal contact claims, and especially his photographs, with considerable suspicion from very early on, arguing that his claims, whatever their sincerity, were doing serious damage to the broader credibility of UFO research as a field by association. That suspicion was not without foundation, and it deepened considerably over time as independent investigators examined Adamski's physical evidence more closely. Adamski's famous photographs of the Venusian scout craft, which superficially resembled a domed disc with 3 spherical landing gear protrusions, were subjected to extensive scrutiny by both skeptical researchers and, at times, by figures within the UFO research community itself, who had initially been more sympathetic to Adamski's claims. Critics pointed to strong visual and structural similarities between the craft in Adamski's photographs and certain ordinary household and mechanical objects of the era, most notably a particular style of chicken brooder lamp and various commercially available light fixture components, similarities detailed enough that several researchers over the following decades constructed and photographed their own small models using ordinary hardware store parts that, when photographed under similar conditions, produced images bearing a striking resemblance to Adamski's original photographs. Adamski himself and his supporters disputed these comparisons and maintained throughout his life that his photographic evidence was genuine, but the accumulated weight of this technical criticism developed and refined over years of investigation by researchers with no particular ideological stake in discrediting the broader UFO phenomenon as a whole, contributed substantially to a growing consensus, even among many within the UFO research community, that Adamski's specific evidence did not hold up to careful physical examination. James Moseley, a prominent UFO researcher, publisher, and, in his own words, a self-described trickster figure within the field, who nonetheless conducted extensive first-hand investigation into numerous contactee claims of the era, was among those who grew increasingly skeptical of Adamski's specific claims over the course of the 1950s, despite having initially found aspects of the broader contactee phenomenon worthy of serious attention. Moseley and other researchers who conducted independent inquiries into Adamski's background, his claimed witnesses, and the physical evidence he presented, generally concluded in various published assessments over the following decades that while Adamski was undeniably a compelling and effective public speaker with a genuine gift for making his claims feel emotionally and spiritually resonant to receptive audiences, the specific factual and physical claims underlying his story did not withstand rigorous scrutiny, a conclusion that has remained the dominant, though not universal, assessment among UFO researchers and historians who have examined the case in detail in the decades since. It is worth noting, in fairness to the full complexity of the historical record, that Adamski retained sincere defenders throughout his life and afterward, including individuals who had personally known him, who described him as a warm, thoughtful person who appeared to genuinely believe in the reality and importance of his own experiences and his broader philosophical message about cosmic brotherhood and the dangers of nuclear weapons, regardless of how one ultimately judges the physical evidence he presented. Some of his defenders have argued that even if specific photographs or physical details of his account can be disputed or explained through more mundane means, the core of his message, particularly his emphasis on nuclear disarmament and interplanetary cooperation delivered at the height of Cold War anxiety, resonated with something genuine and important in the cultural moment, regardless of its literal factual accuracy, an argument that speaks more to Adamski's cultural and psychological significance than to the specific truth of his Venusian contact claims. George Adamski continued lecturing, writing, and defending his claims until his death in 1965, remaining, until the very end of his life, the single most publicly recognizable face of the Venusian contactee phenomenon, a position that his numerous imitators and successors, whom we will examine in detail in the next part of this series, never fully managed to displace, even as some of those later contactees offered accounts that were, in certain respects, more elaborate or more specific than Adamski's own original story. What Adamski established, whatever the ultimate truth or falsehood of his personal claims, was a template, a narrative structure, and a set of expectations that would shape nearly every subsequent Venusian contact claim that followed him throughout the 1950s. A chance desert or rural encounter, a beautiful and serene human-like visitor, a message centered on nuclear anxiety and cosmic spiritual brotherhood, and a claimed origin on the planet Venus specifically, rather than some more generic or unspecified extraterrestrial world. In this sense, whatever one ultimately concludes about the physical reality behind Adamski's photographs and his account of a desert meeting in November of 1952, his cultural significance is difficult to overstate. He did not simply report a UFO sighting. He created, almost single-handedly, the entire narrative shape of the modern Venusian contact story, a shape that other contactees, some of whom we turn to next, would adopt, adapt, and in their own ways elaborate upon throughout the remainder of that remarkable decade. The other contactees. George Adamski may have been the first and most famous figure to claim personal contact with a Venusian visitor, but within just a few years of his story becoming an international sensation, he was far from alone. Throughout the mid to late 1950s, a wave of similar claims emerged across the United States and, to a lesser extent, in Britain and elsewhere, each following a broadly recognizable pattern: a chance meeting, a beautiful and serene human-like visitor, a message of cosmic concern, and a stated origin on Venus or among a loosely defined confederation of worlds that included Venus as a prominent member. Understanding this wider contactee movement, rather than treating Adamski as an isolated figure, is essential to understanding just how widespread and, for a time, culturally significant the belief in Venusian visitors actually became. Howard Menger, a sign painter and small business owner living in High Bridge, New Jersey, offered one of the most elaborate and, in certain respects, most personally intimate of all the major contactee accounts of the era. Unlike Adamski, who dated the beginning of his contact experience to a single dramatic desert encounter in 1952, Menger claimed his relationship with Venusian visitors stretched back to his own childhood in the 1930s. When he said he first encountered a beautiful woman near his family's rural New Jersey property, who, he later came to understand, was not an ordinary human being, but a visitor from Venus. According to Menger's later published accounts, this early encounter was followed by decades of intermittent contact, culminating in the 1950s in a series of much more dramatic experiences, including claimed meetings with multiple Venusian individuals, invitations aboard their craft, and, in his most expansive claims, a brief visit to the surface of Venus itself, which Menger described in terms that closely echoed the older swamp and jungle Venus hypotheses discussed earlier in this series, portraying the planet as lush, warm, and abundant with plant life, populated by a civilization that lived in harmony with that environment, using advanced but seemingly organic technology. Menger's account included a particularly notable and much discussed detail. He claimed that one of his principal Venusian contacts, a woman he described in his writings with evident personal warmth and admiration, eventually became his second wife, a claim that added a distinctly romantic and deeply personal dimension to his story that set it apart from most other contactee accounts of the period, which typically describe the visitors in more distant, almost reverential spiritual terms, rather than as figures with whom the contactee developed an ongoing personal and eventually marital relationship. Menger published his experiences in a book titled From Outer Space to You in 1959, and he supplemented his written claims with public demonstrations, including displays of what he described as Venusian food samples and other physical artifacts he said had been given to him during his contacts, along with photographs of craft that, like Adamski's, drew significant skepticism from researchers who examined them closely. Menger's claims proved considerably more difficult for even sympathetic UFO researchers to fully accept than some of the other contactee accounts of the era, in part because of their sheer scope and elaboration, and in part because Menger himself, later in life, offered a series of statements that complicated the public's understanding of his own claims, at different points suggesting that at least some elements of his story had been embellished, exaggerated, or presented for effect in ways that went beyond a strictly literal account of his personal experiences, statements that some of his supporters interpreted charitably as reflecting a more symbolic or spiritually allegorical intent behind parts of his narrative, while critics took them as something closer to a partial admission that significant portions of his story had never been meant as literal fact in the first place. Whatever the correct interpretation of those later statements, Menger's case illustrates something important about the broader contactee movement. The line between sincere personal belief, conscious embellishment for a receptive audience, and outright invention was, in numerous cases across this era, considerably blurrier and harder to draw with confidence than either the contactees' most devoted supporters or their harshest critics were typically willing to acknowledge. Truman Bethurum offered a different flavor of contact claim, one that became particularly well known for its central figure, a woman Bethurum described as the captain of a Venusian scout craft. Bethurum, a shift worker employed on road construction crews in the Mojave Desert, claimed that in the summer of 1952, working a night shift, he encountered a landed disc-shaped craft and was invited aboard, where he met and spoke with its captain, a striking and, in Bethurum's admiring description, extraordinarily beautiful woman he identified by the name Aura Raines, whom he said commanded a crew of several men aboard the vessel, and identified their world of origin as a planet Bethurum called Clarion, which he described as existing on the far side of the sun from Earth, always hidden from view, though in his subsequent writing and lecture material, Bethurum connected Clarion and its inhabitants closely with the broader Venusian contact narrative circulating at the time, and Aura Raines and her crew were frequently discussed within the wider contactee community of the era in direct connection with the general concept of Venusian visitors, reflecting how loosely and interchangeably the terminology of specific planetary origin was sometimes applied across different contactee accounts. Bethurum published his account in a 1954 book titled Aboard a Flying Saucer, and he went on to become a popular figure on the contactee lecture circuit throughout the mid-1950s, drawing considerable public attention and, like Menger, generating a devoted following captivated in significant part by his evidently sincere and effusive admiration for Aura Raines, whom he described repeatedly in terms emphasizing her beauty, her calm authority, and her evident fondness for him personally. Bethurum's claims, like those of the other contactees discussed in this part, received extensive skeptical scrutiny from UFO researchers and journalists of the era, who noted the absence of any corroborating witnesses to his central, claimed encounters and pointed to inconsistencies across his various retellings of the story over the following years, inconsistencies that researchers who tracked the contactee movement closely came to regard as a recurring pattern across nearly all of these individual cases, in which the core story tended to grow more elaborate and more specific with each subsequent retelling, lecture, and published edition, rather than remaining fixed and consistent as a genuinely singular remembered event might be expected to do. Cedric Allingham's case occupies a somewhat different and, in the long run, particularly instructive place in the history of the Venusian contactee phenomenon because it became, decades after its original publication, one of the more thoroughly and convincingly unraveled hoaxes associated with the movement. Allingham, presented to the public as a British amateur astronomer, published a book in 1954 titled Flying Saucer from Mars, and despite its title, the book described an encounter said to have taken place on the coast of Scotland with a tall, human-like visitor who communicated with Allingham partly through gesture and partly through a limited amount of speech, and who indicated, through a combination of methods Allingham described in detail, that he came originally from Mars, but had recently visited Venus as part of his ongoing travels through the solar system, a detail that firmly ties Allingham's case into the broader web of Venusian contact lore circulating at the time, even though his own claimed visitor was presented as Martian rather than Venusian by origin. Allingham's account closely mirrored key structural elements of Adamski's original 1952 story. closely enough that several researchers at the time and in later decades suspected a direct and deliberate connection between the two cases. Decades later, extensive investigative work carried out by researchers including Christopher Allen and Stuart Campbell, published in the 1980s, made a detailed and, to most subsequent researchers, quite convincing case that Cedric Allingham never existed as an independent real person at all, and that the entire account had been fabricated, likely by a British writer and broadcaster with a documented interest in satirizing the growing contactee phenomenon, working in coordination with an associate who briefly posed in public as Allingham for a small number of promotional appearances arranged around the book's publication. If this later research is correct, and it has been broadly, though not universally, accepted within the community of researchers who study the history of the UFO contactee phenomenon, the Allingham case stands as a particularly clear example of a deliberate literary hoax constructed specifically to exploit and, in the view of its likely author, to gently mock the public appetite for Venusian and Martian contact stories that Adamski's runaway success had so effectively demonstrated existed. The case is worth dwelling on precisely because it illustrates, in an unusually well-documented way, exactly how easily a fabricated contact account, carefully modeled on an already successful template, could be constructed, published, and accepted by a receptive public audience during this period. Buck Nelson, a farmer from Missouri, offered yet another variation on the same general pattern, claiming a series of encounters beginning in 1954 with visitors he identified as coming from Venus, Mars, and the Moon, whom he described meeting on his own rural property and, in his more expansive later claims, aboard their craft during trips that took him, by his own account, on journeys around the solar system. Nelson's claims included descriptions of a large dog belonging to the visitors, a detail that became something of a distinctive and memorable feature of his particular account within the broader contactee literature of the era, alongside more conventional elements shared with other contactee stories, including messages emphasizing peace, spiritual brotherhood, and concern about human warfare and nuclear weapons. Nelson published his own account and organized regular public gatherings on his Missouri farm throughout the later 1950s, drawing hundreds of attendees at points to what became known informally as spacecraft conventions, events that brought together contactees, their supporters, and curious members of the public for lectures, testimonials, and communal gatherings that took on, in the description of several researchers and journalists who attended and later wrote about them, an atmosphere considerably closer to a religious revival meeting than to a conventional scientific or investigative conference. These gatherings, of which Nelson's Missouri Farm Conventions were among the most prominent examples during the mid to late 1950s, deserve particular attention in their own right, because they reveal something important about the contactee movement that a narrow focus on any single individual's claims tends to obscure. This was not simply a series of isolated, unconnected personal claims made by scattered individuals across the country. It was, by the middle of the decade, a genuine and organized social movement with its own recurring public events, its own informal network of publishers and lecture circuits, its own shared vocabulary and set of narrative conventions, and its own internal community of believers who traveled between different contactees' events, compared notes, and in some cases became personally acquainted with one another across the various individual cases. Adamski, Menger, Bethurham, and Nelson, along with numerous less prominent contactees whose specific claims never achieved the same level of lasting fame, were not simply competitors telling similar stories in isolation from one another. They were, to a significant degree, participants in a shared subculture, one that had developed its own internal expectations about what a genuine contact account should include, a set of expectations clearly traceable back to Adamski's foundational 1952 story, and its elaboration in his subsequent books, and reinforced through direct social contact between the various contactees and their overlapping communities of supporters. It's worth asking, at this point in the series, what these figures, taken collectively, actually have in common beyond the surface details of their individual stories, because the shared pattern is itself revealing. Nearly every major contactee of this era described their Venusian or broader extraterrestrial visitors in strikingly similar physical terms: tall, human-like, often blonde or fair-haired, unusually beautiful by conventional human standards, and radiating a calm, serene, almost beatific demeanor utterly unlike ordinary human behavior under comparable circumstances. Nearly every account emphasized a message centered on two closely related themes: anxiety about humanity's development and use of nuclear weapons, an understandable preoccupation given the specific historical moment in which these claims emerged, and a broader concept of cosmic spiritual brotherhood, the idea that Earth was a comparatively young and undeveloped member of a much larger community of inhabited worlds, watched over with benevolent concern by more advanced civilizations eager to help guide humanity toward a more peaceful and spiritually mature future. And nearly every account, when subjected to close investigative scrutiny by skeptical researchers, revealed significant problems with corroborating evidence, consistency across retellings, and verifiable physical proof, problems that accumulated, case after case, into a pattern serious enough that even researchers within the broader UFO community, who were often quite willing to take seriously the possibility of genuine unexplained aerial phenomena more generally, grew increasingly convinced over the course of the 1950s that the specific claims of the contactees represented something categorically different from, and considerably less credible than, the broader and more ambiguous body of ordinary UFO sighting reports being investigated during the same period. This consistency across so many independent cases, the same physical description of the visitors, the same thematic emphasis on nuclear anxiety and cosmic brotherhood, the same basic narrative structure of a chance encounter, followed by escalating claims of further contact, raises a question that the next part of this series will address directly. Where did this remarkably specific and remarkably consistent picture of a peaceful, blonde, spiritually advanced, human-like race actually come from in the first place? It is not a picture that arises naturally or inevitably from the raw fact of an unidentified light or craft observed in the sky. It is a specific, detailed, and culturally particular set of expectations about what an advanced extraterrestrial visitor would look like and what message such a visitor would bring. And as it turns out, that specific picture did not originate with Adamski or with any of the contactees who followed him. It originated decades earlier in a body of esoteric spiritual teaching that had already described spiritually advanced beings living on Venus. Using language and imagery, the contactees would echo so closely that the connection, once traced carefully, becomes difficult to view as coincidental. That esoteric tradition and its surprisingly direct line of influence running forward into the contactee movement of the 1950s is where our story turns next. The esoteric roots: Theosophy, Ascended Masters, and the Ashtar Command. To understand where the specific, remarkably consistent image of the Venusian, tall, blonde, serene, spiritually advanced, and deeply concerned with humanity's moral and nuclear development actually came from, we have to leave the desert encounters of the 1950s behind for a moment and go back much further to a religious and philosophical movement founded in New York City in 1875, more than 75 years before George Adamski ever claimed to meet a being named Orthon. That movement was the Theosophical Society, founded primarily through the efforts of a Russian emigre named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, along with the American Henry Steele Olcott, and it would go on to have an influence on 20th century popular spirituality and, as this part of our series will show, on the modern Venusian contact narrative specifically, that is difficult to overstate and that most casual observers of the UFO phenomenon never fully realize. Blavatsky presented herself as a channel and interpreter for a body of ancient, hidden spiritual wisdom, transmitted to her, she claimed, through direct contact with a group of highly advanced spiritual teachers she referred to as masters or Mahatmas, beings who had, according to theosophical teaching, achieved an extraordinarily high level of spiritual evolution far beyond that of ordinary human beings, and who worked, largely from hidden or remote locations, to quietly guide the spiritual development of humanity as a whole across the centuries. Blavatsky's major published works, including Isis Unveiled in 1877, and more significantly for the material we're tracing in this part, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888, laid out an elaborate and enormously ambitious cosmology describing the evolution of consciousness across successive cosmic cycles, involving not only human spiritual development on Earth, but a much larger, interconnected system encompassing other planets within the solar system, each of which, according to this theosophical cosmology, played its own distinct role in the broader unfolding of spiritual evolution across the cosmos as a whole. Within this framework, later theosophical writers, building on and elaborating Blavatsky's original teachings after her death in 1891, developed an increasingly specific and detailed set of claims about advanced spiritual beings, connected to Venus in particular. The most significant of these figures is one whose name will likely be unfamiliar to most people who have never studied theosophical literature directly, but who occupies an outsized and directly relevant place in the history we are tracing in this series, a being called Sanat Kumara. According to teachings developed and popularized primarily by later theosophical writers, including Charles Webster Leadbeater and Alice Bailey, both of whom were enormously influential in shaping 20th century esoteric spirituality far beyond the boundaries of the Theosophical Society itself, Sanat Kumara was described as an extraordinarily advanced spiritual being who came to Earth in the remote past, described in various tellings as many millions of years ago, specifically from the planet Venus, in order to help guide and accelerate humanity's spiritual evolution at a critical early stage of its development. Sanat Kumara was said in this teaching to preside over a hidden spiritual center called Shambhala, sometimes located in accounts within the Gobi Desert or in some more purely mystical, non-physical dimension, depending on the specific writer and tradition, from which he continued to exercise a kind of spiritual governance over Earth's ongoing development, functioning within theosophical cosmology as something like the planet's presiding spiritual authority, explicitly and specifically identified as having originated on Venus. It is difficult to overstate how directly relevant this specific piece of esoteric teaching is to everything the contactees of the 1950s would go on to claim. Here, in published spiritual literature circulating widely from the late 19th century onward, decades before the first flying saucer sighting of 1947, was an already well-developed teaching describing an advanced, benevolent, spiritually superior being who had come to Earth specifically from Venus in order to guide and help humanity's development, watching over our species from a position of loving concern. This is, in its essential structure, precisely the narrative Adamski, Menger, Bethurum, and the other contactees would go on to describe: a benevolent Venusian visitor concerned about humanity's spiritual and moral development, offering guidance intended to help Earth avoid self-destruction and progress toward a more advanced and peaceful future. The contactees did not need to invent this narrative structure from nothing. It had already been circulating in a recognizably similar form within American and European esoteric spiritual circles for the better part of a century before any of them made their public claims. This influence was not merely a matter of vague, diffuse cultural background either. There is documented and specific evidence connecting individual contactees directly to theosophical and related esoteric teaching prior to their public UFO claims. George Adamski himself, before his fame as a UFO contactee, had spent years involved in various spiritual and philosophical teaching activities in Southern California, including running an organization that taught a body of spiritual philosophy drawing significantly on theosophical and related esoteric concepts, activities that predate his 1952 claimed encounter by well over a decade. Researchers who have studied Adamski's biography closely have noted that his pre-1952 spiritual teaching work already included themes of cosmic brotherhood, spiritual evolution, and the guidance of humanity by more advanced beings, themes that map closely onto both the theosophical Sanat Kumara teaching and onto the specific message Adamski would later attribute to Orthon, suggesting that Adamski's famous 1952 claim did not emerge from nowhere, but represented, at least in part, a dramatic, externalized, and physicalized retelling of spiritual themes he had already been personally engaged with and teaching to others for years beforehand. This same esoteric current fed into the contactee movement through another important and closely related channel, a spiritual and religious movement known as the I Am activity, founded in the early 1930s by an American mining engineer named Guy Ballard, along with his wife Edna Ballard. Guy Ballard claimed to have encountered, during a hike on Mount Shasta in California in 1930, an advanced spiritual being who identified himself as the Comte de Saint-Germain, a figure with roots in earlier European esoteric legend, and who Ballard said initiated him into a body of hidden spiritual teaching concerning what the movement called ascended masters, beings who had once been ordinary human beings but had, through spiritual attainment, transcended physical death and continued to exist and work on behalf of humanity's spiritual development from a higher, non-physical plane of existence. The I Am activity, which Ballard and his wife built into a large and, for a time, quite influential religious movement through the 1930s, drew extensively and explicitly on earlier theosophical concepts, including the broader idea of a hidden spiritual hierarchy guiding Earth's development, and it helped popularize, for a much wider American audience than the more academically oriented Theosophical Society had ever reached, the general concept of physically encountering an advanced spiritual being in an ordinary outdoor setting, a structural template, a chance meeting in a natural setting with a being of extraordinary spiritual attainment that maps with striking closeness onto the desert and rural encounter settings so consistently favored by the Venusian contactees 2 decades later. The specific connection between this broader esoteric tradition and the Venusian contactee movement of the 1950s becomes even more direct and explicit when we turn to a figure named George Van Tassel, whose case sits at almost the exact midpoint between the world of theosophical and ascended master teaching on one hand and the more overtly UFO-focused contactee movement exemplified by Adamski on the other. Van Tassel, a former aviation engineer who had at one point worked for Douglas Aircraft and Lockheed, relocated in the late 1940s to Giant Rock, a large and, in Native American tradition, spiritually significant rock formation in the California desert, where he established an airport and began holding regular meditation sessions inside a cave beneath the rock formation itself. Van Tassel claimed that beginning in 1952, the same year as Adamski's famous encounter, he began receiving telepathic communications from an entity identifying itself as Ashtar, described as the commander of a large interplanetary fleet operating under what Van Tassel and later channelers of the same entity described as a benevolent spiritual and technological confederation of worlds, a confederation that included Venus among its most prominent and frequently mentioned member civilizations. Van Tassel's channeled Ashtar material, which he published and lectured on extensively throughout the 1950s, closely blended the language of theosophical and ascended master spiritual teaching with the more overtly technological and aeronautical vocabulary of the emerging UFO phenomenon, describing Ashtar's fleet in terms that combined spiritual mission language, warnings about humanity's nuclear weapons and spiritual immaturity, with descriptions of advanced spacecraft, interplanetary councils, and a broader confederation, explicitly said to include representatives from Venus, a detail that ties Van Tassel's channeled material directly back into the same specific planetary focus we have been tracing throughout this series. Van Tassel went on to organize large annual public gatherings at Giant Rock beginning in 1953, events that became known as the Giant Rock Spacecraft Conventions, and that, at their peak later in the decade, drew crowds reportedly numbering in the thousands, bringing together contactees, channelers, UFO researchers, and curious members of the public in a manner directly comparable to the Missouri farm gatherings organized by Buck Nelson that we discussed in the previous part of this series, and reinforcing through these large, shared public events the ongoing cross-pollination between the overtly esoteric and spiritual wing of the movement, exemplified by Van Tassel's channeled Ashtar material, and the more claims of physical encounter wing exemplified by Adamski, Menger, and Bethurum. The entity Ashtar, first introduced to a wide public audience through Van Tassel's channeling in the 1950s, would go on to have an extraordinarily long afterlife within esoteric and New Age spiritual circles that extends remarkably all the way to the present day, channeled and reinterpreted by a long succession of later spiritual teachers and channelers over the following decades under the collective and evolving concept generally referred to as the Ashtar command, a concept that has continued to incorporate and reinforce the idea of Venus as a source of benevolent, spiritually advanced extraterrestrial guidance for humanity, long after the original 1950s contactee movement had largely faded from mainstream public attention. This continuity is worth noting because it demonstrates that the Venusian contact narrative we have been tracing throughout this series did not simply rise and fall within the specific historical window of the 1950s contactee movement, but instead became absorbed into and continued to circulate within a much longer-running and more diffuse esoteric and New Age spiritual tradition that persists in various forms into the 21st century, a point we will return to in a later part of this series when we discuss the broader cultural legacy of the Venusian myth. What emerges from tracing this esoteric lineage carefully, from Blavatsky's original Theosophical Cosmology through Leadbeater and Bailey's development of the specifically Venusian Sanat Kumara teaching, through Guy Ballard's I Am activity and its popularization of the Ascended Master encounter narrative, and finally through Van Tassel's explicit channeling of an entity describing a Venus-linked interplanetary confederation, is a clear and well-documented alternative explanation for where the contactee's remarkably specific and remarkably consistent picture of the Venusian visitor actually originated. It did not spring, fully formed, from the individual imaginations of Adamski, Menger, Bethurum, and the others, each independently and coincidentally arriving at nearly identical descriptions of tall, blonde, serene beings from Venus, concerned with humanity's nuclear weapons and spiritual development. It was, in a very real and traceable sense, already there, embedded in decades of American esoteric religious teaching that had been developing and circulating this exact cluster of ideas since at least the 1880s, absorbed by contactees who had, in several documented cases, including Adamski's own, direct personal exposure to this esoteric teaching tradition before they ever made their public UFO claims, and then translated by these contactees, consciously or unconsciously, out of the more purely spiritual and mystical register of Theosophical and Ascended Master teaching and into the newly popular and culturally resonant vocabulary of flying saucers, space visitors, and interplanetary confederations that the post-war UFO phenomenon had made suddenly current and exciting to a much broader public audience than pure esoteric spirituality had ever reached on its own. This is not to say that every single detail of every contactee's account can be traced directly back to a specific piece of prior Theosophical or Ascended Master literature, or that the contactees were engaged in simple, deliberate plagiarism of earlier esoteric texts. The relationship is better understood as a kind of deep cultural absorption and reinterpretation in which ideas that had been circulating for decades within American esoteric and alternative spiritual subcultures, ideas about hidden spiritual hierarchies, about advanced beings guiding humanity's development from other worlds, and about Venus specifically as a source of that guidance, provided a ready-made narrative and symbolic framework that the contactees drew upon, whether fully consciously or not, when they came to describe their own claimed personal experiences. The specific historical moment of the early 1950s, with its unique combination of atomic age anxiety, rapidly advancing aerospace technology, and a public imagination already primed by decades of science fiction as described earlier in this series, provided the immediate spark and the receptive cultural audience, but the deeper narrative material, the actual content and shape of what an advanced Venusian visitor was supposed to look like and say, had been quietly accumulating within American esoteric religious culture for the better part of a century before that spark arrived. This same esoteric tradition also helps explain a detail about the contactee movement that might otherwise seem puzzling: why the visitors described by Adamski, Menger, Bethurum, and the others were so consistently and specifically human-like in physical appearance, rather than exhibiting the more exotic, non-human physical characteristics that would come to dominate later, post-1960s alien abduction narratives and their now familiar imagery of large-headed, large-eyed beings quite different in physical form from ordinary human beings. The theosophical and ascended master tradition, from which the contactee narrative drew so heavily, had never described its advanced spiritual beings as physically alien or non-human in appearance. Quite the opposite. Sanat Kumara, the ascended masters of the I Am activity, and the various beings channeled by Van Tassel and others were consistently described as appearing fully human, often unusually beautiful and physically perfected in form, precisely because the underlying esoteric teaching held that spiritual advancement manifested itself, among other things, as an idealized and perfected human form, rather than as some biologically distinct alien morphology. The contactees, drawing on this tradition, naturally inherited this same expectation, describing their Venusian visitors not as strange or alien in appearance, but as beautiful, idealized versions of ordinary human beings. Tall, fair, serene, and physically flawless, a description that makes considerably more sense once its true esoteric origin, rather than any purely scientific or science-fictional source, is properly understood. Having now traced both of the two major cultural currents that fed into the Venusian contactee movement of the 1950s, the genuine scientific uncertainty about Venus's physical conditions and the popular science fiction imagination that grew alongside it, covered in the earlier parts of this series, and the deeper esoteric and theosophical tradition specifically responsible for the human-like, spiritually advanced character of the Venusian visitor described in this part, we are now in a position to turn to a different and, in its own way, equally important dimension of this story: how the American government, military, and broader official establishment actually responded in real time to a public phenomenon that combined popular science speculation, pulp fiction imagery, and increasingly organized esoteric spiritual claims into a genuinely significant social movement, one large enough and persistent enough that it could not simply be ignored by the official Cold War institutions whose job it was to monitor, understand, and where necessary manage American public opinion and public anxiety during one of the most tense and uncertain periods of the entire 20th century. Cold War anxieties, government, military, and the Venusian question. By the time George Adamski's claims reached international bestseller status in 1953, the American government and military had already been formally investigating the broader phenomenon of unidentified flying objects for several years, through a series of official inquiries that had begun almost immediately after the first wave of widely reported saucer sightings in the summer of 1947. Understanding how these official investigations related to, and largely diverged from, the specific Venusian contactee claims we have examined throughout this series requires distinguishing carefully between two related but ultimately quite different phenomena that were often conflated in the public mind at the time, and that remain conflated in popular memory even today. The broader question of unidentified aerial sightings, which the government took seriously enough to investigate through a sequence of formal programs over more than 2 decades, and the specific, much more extraordinary claims of personal contact and communication with human-like beings from Venus, which official investigators, almost without exception, treated from a very early stage as an entirely separate category of claim, one deserving considerably less credence than the broader sighting reports. The United States Air Force's formal investigation into unidentified flying objects began in 1948 under the name Project Sign, which was succeeded in 1949 by a follow-up effort known as Project Grudge, before finally being reorganized in 1952, the same pivotal year as Adamski's famous desert encounter, into the program that would become by far the most well-known of the three, Project Blue Book, which continued operating until it was formally closed in 1969. Over the course of its existence, Blue Book investigators reviewed and cataloged more than 12,000 individual reports of unidentified aerial phenomena, ultimately concluding that the overwhelming majority could be explained as misidentified aircraft, weather phenomena, astronomical objects, or, in a significant number of cases, straightforward hoaxes, while leaving a smaller residual percentage of cases officially classified as unexplained due to insufficient information to reach a definitive conclusion either way. Project Blue Book's own internal records and its official public statements make clear that Air Force investigators regarded contactee claims of the kind advanced by Adamski, Menger, Betherum, and their contemporaries as belonging to an entirely different and considerably less credible category than the broader body of ordinary sighting reports the program was set up to investigate. Air Force public relations statements throughout the 1950s consistently and explicitly distanced the official investigation from contactee claims, emphasizing that Blue Book's mandate concerned the analysis of reported sightings of unidentified objects and did not extend to, and did not lend any official credibility to, claims of personal meetings, communication, or travel aboard alien spacecraft. This official skepticism toward the contactees specifically, even while the broader sighting phenomenon continued to receive serious institutional attention and resources, reflects an important and often underappreciated nuance in the historical record. The government's relationship to the UFO phenomenon during this period was considerably more complicated and more differentiated than either the most credulous popular retellings or the most dismissive skeptical accounts of the era typically suggest. This is not to say that government and intelligence agencies were entirely indifferent to the contactee phenomenon and the broader public reaction it generated. Quite the opposite. The sheer scale of public interest in flying saucers by the early 1950s, fueled by the extensive newspaper and magazine coverage of the broader sighting wave and given an enormous additional boost by the runaway commercial success of Adamski's book and the growing contactee lecture circuit, had become, in itself, a matter of serious concern to certain elements within the American national security establishment, for reasons that had relatively little to do with whether any of the claims were actually true, and considerably more to do with the practical Cold War-era anxieties the phenomenon threatened to generate. In January of 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency convened a panel of prominent scientists, chaired by the physicist H.P. Robertson, to review the available evidence on unidentified flying objects and provide recommendations regarding how the government should handle the phenomenon going forward. This body, which came to be known as the Robertson Panel, met over several days and reviewed a selection of the most compelling UFO evidence and case files that had been compiled by Air Force investigators up to that point, including photographic and film evidence. The panel's final conclusions, later declassified and made available to researchers, found no persuasive evidence that the sightings under review represented a genuine threat to national security or evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, but the panel expressed a specific and, in hindsight, quite revealing concern that had nothing to do with the reality or unreality of the phenomenon itself. The worry that continued public fascination with unidentified flying objects could, in a moment of genuine Cold War crisis, clog official communication and reporting channels with a flood of civilian sighting reports at precisely the moment when those channels needed to remain clear and available to detect a genuine Soviet attack, a concern that reflected the specific anxieties of an era in which the possibility of a surprise nuclear strike was treated as a serious and immediate planning consideration by American military and intelligence planners. The Robertson panel went further, recommending that the government undertake what it described as an educational campaign intended to reduce public interest in and anxiety about UFO reports, aimed specifically at what the panel characterized as the potential for the phenomenon to be exploited in some hypothetical future scenario by hostile foreign powers as a tool of psychological pressure or disinformation against the American public, a recommendation grounded less in any specific evidence that the Soviet Union was actually attempting such exploitation and more in a general Cold War-era institutional instinct to treat any source of mass public excitement or anxiety as a potential vulnerability requiring active management. This recommendation, whatever its ultimate practical effect, reveals something important about how seriously the broader UFO phenomenon, quite apart from the specific contactee claims examined throughout this series, was being taken at high levels of the American national security establishment by the early 1950s, not necessarily as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, but as a significant social and psychological phenomenon in its own right, one considered important enough to warrant direct attention from a panel of prominent scientists convened by the Central Intelligence Agency. The specific claims of the Venusian contactees occupied a somewhat different and generally lower rung of official concern than the broader sighting phenomenon the Robertson panel was primarily focused on, but they were not entirely ignored by federal law enforcement either. The Federal Bureau of Investigation maintained a file on George Adamski, specifically a file that has since been released in redacted form under subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests and is available for researchers and members of the public to examine today. The file's contents reveal that the Bureau's interest in Adamski centered primarily on relatively mundane concerns rather than any serious investigation into the truth of his extraterrestrial contact claims. Internal correspondence within the file documents instances of the Bureau receiving inquiries from members of the public and from other government offices about Adamski, along with internal discussion of whether his activities, particularly the sale of his books and his public lectures, might constitute any form of mail fraud or other prosecutable offense. A line of inquiry the Bureau's own internal review appears to have concluded did not rise to the level of a prosecutable federal crime, since Adamski was, in the Bureau's assessment, engaged in the promotion and sale of what amounted to a claimed personal belief and philosophy rather than a demonstrably fraudulent commercial scheme in the specific legal sense the Bureau would have needed to establish for any prosecution to proceed. This pattern, official government bodies treating contactee claims specifically as a matter of relatively low priority, generally approached through the lens of ordinary law enforcement or public relations management rather than as a serious avenue of scientific or intelligence investigation, while reserving more substantial institutional attention and resources for the broader and more ambiguous category of unidentified aerial sighting reports held consistently across the various government bodies that touched on the UFO phenomenon during this period. It reflects an underlying and, in retrospect, quite reasonable official judgment. An unidentified light or object captured on radar or witnessed by a trained military pilot represented a genuine anomaly requiring investigation, since it might, after all, turn out to be a misidentified but entirely mundane aircraft, weather balloon, or astronomical phenomenon, or in the more anxious Cold War framing that undoubtedly motivated at least some of the official interest, it might conceivably represent a Soviet reconnaissance craft or advanced weapon system whose existence and capabilities American intelligence urgently needed to understand. A claimed personal meeting with a beautiful, telepathically communicating visitor from Venus, corroborated by nothing more than photographs that quickly drew serious technical criticism and affidavits that, as we discussed earlier in this series, did not actually confirm the central extraordinary claim itself, presented a fundamentally different evidentiary situation, one that official investigators, working from the standards of evidence that reasonably applied to a national security investigation, were generally quick to set aside as considerably less credible and considerably less worthy of sustained institutional attention. The United States was not alone among Cold War-era governments in establishing some form of official inquiry into the broader UFO phenomenon during this period. The British government convened its own review, known as the Flying Saucer Working Party, operating between 1950 and 1951 under the auspices of the Ministry of Defense, which examined the available evidence for unidentified aerial phenomena reported in British airspace and reached conclusions broadly similar in spirit to those the American Robertson panel would reach a couple of years later, finding no persuasive evidence of extraterrestrial visitation or any other extraordinary explanation for the reports under review, while nonetheless treating the underlying question with a level of formal institutional seriousness that reflected genuine, if ultimately unresolved, official uncertainty about what exactly was generating at least some portion of the more credible sighting reports. Other European governments and military establishments maintained their own, generally less extensively documented, informal or formal channels for receiving and reviewing UFO reports during the same period, reflecting the genuinely international scope of the broader phenomenon, even as the specific Venusian contactee movement remained considerably more concentrated within American popular culture, with important but comparatively smaller echoes in Britain, exemplified by cases like Cedric Allingham's discussed earlier in this series, and in continental Europe, where Adamski's own lecture tours, as previously noted, drew substantial public audiences. It's worth pausing here to consider why the Venusian contactee phenomenon specifically, as opposed to the broader UFO sighting phenomenon, never received the kind of sustained, serious official scientific investigation that might, in principle, have been capable of definitively settling the question for the general public one way or the other during the 1950s themselves, rather than only being settled indirectly, years later, through spacecraft missions undertaken for entirely separate scientific purposes, which we will examine in detail in the next part of this series. The answer lies partly in the specific evidentiary problems with the contactee claims already discussed throughout this series, the absence of physical evidence capable of withstanding serious technical scrutiny, the lack of any witness corroboration for the central extraordinary claims themselves, and the recurring pattern of stories growing more elaborate and specific with each retelling, rather than remaining fixed as a genuinely remembered singular event typically would. But it also reflects a deeper structural reality about how mid-century government science operated. Official scientific investigation, whether conducted by the Air Force, the CIA-convened Robertson Panel, or the British Ministry of Defence's Flying Saucer Working Party, was fundamentally oriented around questions of national security and public order, evaluating whether reported phenomena represented genuine threats or genuine unknowns worthy of continued military attention, rather than around the fundamentally different question of adjudicating the truth or falsehood of specific individuals' claimed personal spiritual and extraterrestrial experiences, a task that fell, by default, to independent researchers, journalists, and the growing informal community of UFO investigators discussed at various points throughout this series, operating with far fewer resources and far less institutional authority than any government body, but in many cases conducting considerably more detailed and specific investigation into the individual contactee cases than any official government inquiry ever attempted. There is a final dimension of this Cold War era official response worth addressing directly because it speaks to the genuine psychological atmosphere in which all of these claims, official and unofficial alike, were being made and received by the public. The years in which the Venusian contactee movement rose to its greatest public prominence, roughly 1952 through the late 1950s, were also years of extraordinarily intense and pervasive public anxiety about nuclear war, an anxiety actively cultivated in certain respects by government civil defense programs themselves, which conducted regular air raid drills, distributed public information about fallout shelters, and maintained a level of sustained public messaging about the possibility of nuclear attack that had no real precedent in prior American history. Against this backdrop, it is not difficult to understand why a message of cosmic reassurance, the idea that more advanced beings from a neighboring world were watching over humanity with benevolent concern, worried specifically about our nuclear weapons, and prepared to offer guidance toward a more peaceful future, found such a receptive public audience quite apart from any question of the objective truth of the specific claims being made. The contactees were offering something that official Cold War civil defense messaging conspicuously did not offer, not merely instructions for surviving a nuclear attack, but the considerably more comforting idea that humanity was not actually alone in facing this unprecedented existential danger, that wiser and more advanced neighbors existed nearby, watching, and that their message, however it had been transmitted, and by whatever means it should ultimately be judged credible or not, was fundamentally one of hope rather than doom. This psychological context helps explain why government bodies, even while officially dismissing the specific evidentiary basis of the contactee claims, remained genuinely concerned about the broader social and psychological phenomenon those claims were part of, and why bodies like the Robertson panel worried less about whether Venusians were actually visiting Earth, and more about the practical, social, and security implications of a public so evidently eager to believe they might be. That concern would prove, in a certain sense, to be resolved not by any further government investigation or public relations campaign, but by an entirely different kind of development altogether: the actual arrival, within less than a decade of Adamski's famous desert encounter, of real spacecraft, launched by real space programs, carrying real scientific instruments capable, for the first time in human history, of measuring what conditions on Venus's surface actually were, rather than merely speculating about them from a distance of tens of millions of miles through a permanent and impenetrable layer of cloud. That reckoning, when it came, would settle the scientific question of Venusian habitability with a finality that no amount of government skepticism, official debunking, or journalistic investigation into contactee inconsistencies had fully managed to achieve on its own. And it is to that reckoning that our story turns next. The scientific reckoning, Mariner, Venera, and the true face of Venus. For 3.5 centuries, since Galileo first turned his telescope toward the bright, blank disk of Venus in 1610, the question of what actually existed beneath that planet's permanent shroud of cloud had remained genuinely, scientifically open. Serious astronomers had proposed swamps, oceans, jungles, deserts, and everything in between. Science fiction writers had populated the planet with monsters, primitive tribes, and advanced civilizations. Contactees had claimed direct personal meetings with human-like beings who said they called this hidden world home. Through all of it, nobody, not the most eminent astronomer and not the most devoted contactee, actually knew, with any real certainty, what conditions existed on the surface of Venus. That 3.5 centuries of open question came to a definitive and, for many people at the time, genuinely shocking end within the span of about 13 years, beginning in December of 1962, as human spacecraft finally reached the planet and began sending back real, physical measurements of what was actually there. The first of these missions to succeed was Mariner 2, launched by the United States on the 27th of August, 1962, as part of NASA's early planetary exploration program, and it holds a distinguished place in the history of space exploration as the first spacecraft from any nation to successfully complete a flyby of another planet. On the 14th of December, 1962, Mariner 2 passed within roughly 22,000 miles of Venus, and during that flyby, its onboard instruments, including a microwave radiometer specifically designed to measure the thermal radiation coming from the planet's surface and atmosphere, collected data that would prove immediately and dramatically inconsistent with every version of the swamp, ocean, or jungle Venus hypotheses that had circulated in scientific literature for the preceding 4 decades. The radiometer readings indicated a surface temperature far too high to support liquid water in any conventional form, let alone the humid swamps and dense vegetation that Svante Arrhenius and his scientific successors had proposed, with early analysis suggesting temperatures somewhere in the range of several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead and far beyond anything that had been seriously entertained by even the more cautious prior scientific speculation about the planet. Mariner 2's data also confirmed, through careful analysis in the months following the flyby, that Venus possessed no detectable magnetic field of any significant strength, a finding that added to the growing picture of a planet fundamentally different from Earth in ways that went well beyond simple surface temperature. And subsequent radar observations conducted from Earth-based facilities in the years immediately following the Mariner 2 flyby revealed another deeply strange characteristic of the planet. Venus rotates on its axis extraordinarily slowly, taking approximately 243 Earth days to complete a single rotation, longer than the planet's own orbital year around the Sun, and it does so in a retrograde direction, spinning backward relative to the direction in which it orbits the Sun and relative to the rotation direction of Earth and most other planets in the solar system, a peculiarity whose exact cause cause remains a subject of ongoing scientific investigation and debate even today, with leading hypotheses involving some combination of a massive ancient collision event and the gradual, long-term effects of atmospheric tides interacting with the planet's thick atmosphere over billions of years. The Mariner 2 findings represented the first hard physical evidence directly contradicting the swamp and jungle Venus hypotheses that had shaped both serious scientific speculation and popular culture's image of the planet for decades, but the full and truly staggering extent of just how hostile conditions on Venus actually were would not become clear until the Soviet Union's Venera program, one of the most ambitious and, in its own quiet way, one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the entire Cold War space race, began returning data directly from within Venus's atmosphere and, eventually, from its actual surface. The Venera program, whose name simply means Venus in Russian, ran from the early 1960s through the mid-1980s and involved an extended and often extremely difficult sequence of missions, many of which failed, in whole or in part, due to the sheer difficulty of designing spacecraft capable of surviving conditions that, at the outset of the program, Soviet engineers themselves did not yet fully understand or appreciate. Venera 4, launched in 1967, became the first spacecraft to successfully transmit data from within Venus's atmosphere itself, deploying a descent probe that began relaying atmospheric composition and pressure readings as it fell through the clouds. The data it returned confirmed that Venus's atmosphere was overwhelmingly composed of carbon dioxide, present at concentrations vastly higher than anything in Earth's own atmosphere, and it revealed atmospheric pressures increasing at a rate as the probe continued its descent that ultimately exceeded what the spacecraft had been engineered to withstand, causing it to fail and cease transmission before it ever reached the actual surface, crushed by pressures its designers had significantly underestimated. This pattern of Soviet engineers underestimating just how extreme Venusian surface conditions would prove to be and losing successive spacecraft as a direct result repeated itself across several subsequent Venera missions throughout the late 1960s, each failure providing additional data that allowed Soviet scientists and engineers to progressively refine their understanding of exactly what temperature and pressure tolerances any future lander would need to survive. That refinement finally paid off in December of 1970, when Venera 7 became the first spacecraft from any nation to successfully transmit data directly from the surface of another planet, in this case Venus itself, surviving on the ground for approximately 23 minutes before its transmission ceased, most likely due to the eventual failure of its internal electronics under the sheer thermal and mechanical stress of the environment it had been built to survive, however briefly. The data Venera 7 returned during those 23 minutes confirmed, with a level of direct physical certainty that no telescope or flyby measurement could have provided, exactly how extreme conditions on the Venusian surface truly were. A surface temperature of approximately 887 degrees Fahrenheit, or roughly 475 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead and several other common metals, combined with an atmospheric pressure at the surface of approximately 90 times that of Earth's atmosphere at sea level, a pressure roughly equivalent to what a submarine would experience at a depth of nearly a kilometer beneath Earth's oceans. These were not conditions compatible with liquid water, with any form of vegetation, with any conceivable form of complex multicellular life, as science understands the requirements for such life to exist, and certainly not with the beautiful, serene, human-like Venusians that Adamski, Menger, Bethurum, and their contemporaries had described meeting less than 2 decades earlier. The Soviet Venera program continued to refine its engineering and scientific instrumentation throughout the 1970s, achieving a series of further landmark successes that added texture and specificity to this already stark picture. Venera 9, which landed successfully in October of 1975, achieved another historic first. It transmitted the very first images ever captured from the surface of another planet. Black and white photographs revealing a rocky, sun-baked landscape, Flat slabs of dark stone strewn across the ground beneath a strange, dim, orange-tinted sky, the coloring a direct result of sunlight filtering down through Venus's thick, permanent layer of sulfuric acid clouds before reaching the surface. Later Venera missions throughout the late 1970s and into the mid-1980s continued to refine these findings, capturing additional surface images in improved detail, conducting soil analysis that revealed a composition broadly similar to basaltic volcanic rock found on Earth, and confirming mission after mission the same brutal combination of extreme heat, crushing pressure, and an atmosphere dominated overwhelmingly by carbon dioxide, with clouds composed not of water vapor, as Earth's clouds are, but of concentrated sulfuric acid droplets, a detail that added yet another layer of hostility to an already thoroughly inhospitable picture. Since sulfuric acid is intensely corrosive to most materials, biological or mechanical, that might come into prolonged contact with it. No Venera surface lander survived for longer than approximately 2 hours under these conditions, a limitation dictated not by any failure of Soviet engineering ambition or skill, both of which were considerable and represented some of the most impressive achievements of the entire 20th century space program, but by the sheer physical impossibility of protecting delicate electronic instruments against sustained exposure to temperatures and pressures of this magnitude for any significantly longer period using the technology available at the time, or in truth, using any technology that exists even today. Every single successful Venera surface mission was, in an important sense, a race against the clock from the moment of touchdown, transmitting as much scientific data as possible back to Earth before the spacecraft's own protective shielding inevitably failed and the surrounding hellish environment finally overwhelmed its internal systems. Taken together, the combined data from Mariner 2's 1962 flyby and the full sequence of Soviet Venera missions that followed over the subsequent 2 decades allowed planetary scientists to finally piece together a complete and scientifically well-supported explanation for why Venus, a planet so similar to Earth in size, mass, and overall bulk composition, had ended up in such a radically different and vastly more hostile physical state. The explanation centers on a phenomenon called the runaway greenhouse effect, a more extreme version of the same basic atmospheric process, involving certain gases trapping heat radiated from a planet's surface and preventing it from escaping back into space, that operates in a much more moderate and, crucially, self-regulating form on Earth, where it keeps our own planet's average temperature comfortably within the range necessary for liquid water and life as we know it to exist. On Venus, planetary scientists now believe, based on the accumulated spacecraft evidence, a combination of the planet's closer proximity to the Sun and, potentially, a very early loss of surface water through a process involving solar radiation splitting water molecules in the upper atmosphere, allowing the resulting hydrogen to escape into space, set in motion a self-reinforcing cycle in which rising surface temperatures caused any remaining water and carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere in ever greater quantities, which in turn trapped ever more heat, which in turn drove temperatures even higher in an escalating feedback loop that ultimately left the planet with the extraordinarily thick carbon dioxide-dominated atmosphere and the correspondingly extreme surface temperature that the Mariner and Venera missions directly measured, a stark and sobering illustration many scientists have noted in the years since of what can happen to an Earth-sized, otherwise potentially habitable planet when its climate system tips decisively and irreversibly in the wrong direction. The impact of these findings on the broader public understanding of Venus, and specifically on the contactee movement and its remaining followers, was significant, though the response within that community was considerably more varied and more complicated than a simple, immediate collapse of belief across the board. For some former believers and members of the broader UFO research community who had maintained a degree of open-minded interest in the possibility of Venusian visitors throughout the 1950s, the definitive spacecraft data of the 1960s and 1970s functioned as a genuinely decisive and largely unambiguous refutation, difficult to argue around given the sheer weight and specificity of the physical measurements involved. Temperature readings, pressure readings, and eventually direct photographic images of a scorched, rocky, distinctly uninhabitable surface, all obtained through instruments that had no ideological stake in the outcome one way or another. Many researchers who had previously given at least some benefit of the doubt to the broader plausibility of Venusian contact claims, on the grounds that the true nature of Venus's surface remained genuinely unresolved by the standards of the day, found this specific justification permanently removed by the spacecraft data, and the Venusian contactee movement as a distinct and prominent public phenomenon did, in a broad and general sense, fade considerably in size and cultural visibility over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, even as the broader UFO phenomenon itself, now increasingly reoriented around alien abduction narratives and non-human-like beings rather than the specifically human-like Venusian and Martian visitors of the 1950s contactee era, continued to evolve and persist in new forms. But the response was not universal capitulation to the new physical evidence, and understanding why requires appreciating something important about how deeply held belief systems, whether religious, spiritual, or otherwise, typically respond when confronted with disconfirming evidence of this kind. A number of contactees and their continuing supporters, rather than abandoning their claims outright in the face of the Mariner and Venera data, instead revised and reinterpreted their claims in ways specifically designed to accommodate the newly confirmed hostile surface conditions, without requiring a full renunciation of the underlying belief in Venusian visitors. Some proposed that the Venusian civilization the contactees had described meeting did not live on the planet's physical surface at all, but rather in vast, technologically sophisticated underground cities, shielded from the surface conditions the spacecraft had measured, a modification that allowed the core contact claims to remain technically unfalsified by any surface measurement a probe might make, since no Venera lander or Mariner flyby was capable of detecting or ruling out the existence of underground structures. Others moved even further from any strictly physical framework, proposing that the Venusians existed not as conventional biological beings occupying ordinary three-dimensional physical space in the way the spacecraft data would be relevant to at all, but as higher dimensional or etheric beings existing in some parallel or higher vibrational plane that ordinary physical instruments were fundamentally incapable of detecting or measuring, a move that effectively relocated the entire contact claim outside the domain where physical spacecraft evidence could ever, even in principle, confirm or refute it. These adaptations, the underground city hypothesis and the higher dimensional or etheric being hypothesis, are worth taking seriously as a subject of study in their own right, not because they offer a remotely plausible alternative explanation competitive with the straightforward scientific conclusion that Venus's surface is simply, verifiably, and by direct physical measurement uninhabitable by any known form of life, but because they illustrate a pattern that researchers who study belief systems more broadly have long recognized and documented across many different contexts entirely unrelated to UFOs or Venus specifically. When a strongly held belief encounters direct, credible, disconfirming evidence, one common response is not immediate abandonment of the belief, but rather a creative reformulation of the belief's specific claims in a way that preserves its core emotional and social significance for believers while relocating the belief's testable content to a domain that is more difficult, or in some formulations entirely impossible, to test or falsify going forward. This pattern is not unique to the Venusian contactee movement, and understanding it as an example of a much broader and well-studied phenomenon in the psychology and sociology of belief helps explain why the movement, though considerably diminished in size and mainstream cultural visibility after the 1960s and 1970s spacecraft revelations, never entirely disappeared, persisting in smaller, more specialized communities, and gradually merging with and feeding into the broader currents of later 20th and early 21st century New Age spirituality that we touched on briefly in the previous part of this series and will return to again later. There is finally an important and genuinely fascinating scientific epilogue to this story of spacecraft-confirmed hostility, one that complicates any simple narrative in which the definitive Mariner and Venera data of the 1960s and 1970s permanently and completely close the book on any scientifically serious question of life on or around Venus, even as the specific swamp, jungle, and human-like civilization hypotheses were being definitively laid to rest by direct physical measurement. A small number of scientists, including some of the most respected and creative astronomers of the 20th century, began to notice something curious in the very data that had ended those older hypotheses. While Venus's surface was unambiguously, comprehensively hostile to life as science understands its requirements, a specific layer high in Venus's atmosphere, well above the crushing pressures and scorching temperatures found at ground level, exhibited conditions of temperature and pressure that were, remarkably, not drastically different from conditions found in Earth's own lower atmosphere, a finding that would eventually give rise to one of the more scientifically serious and genuinely still debated hypotheses in the entire history of astrobiology. The possibility, however modest and however different from anything the 1950s contactees ever imagined, that some form of microbial life might exist not on Venus's surface, but suspended within its temperate cloud layer. That hypothesis, its surprising modern history, and the genuine scientific controversy it generated as recently as the year 2020 is where our story turns next. The cloud life hypothesis, Sagan, astrobiology, and the phosphine controversy. It would be easy to assume, given everything covered in the previous part of this series, that the Mariner and Venera missions closed the scientific question of life on or around Venus permanently and completely, leaving nothing further for serious scientists to investigate beyond confirming, mission after mission, just how thoroughly hostile the planet's surface truly was. For a long time, that was very nearly the case, and the specific idea we are about to discuss in this part remained, for decades, a minor footnote within planetary science rather than a subject of major research investment or public attention. But it never entirely disappeared, and in the year 2020, it would suddenly and dramatically return to international headlines in a way that surprised even many scientists who had been aware of the underlying hypothesis for years. The origin of this idea traces back to 1967, remarkably the very same year that the Soviet Venera 4 probe first transmitted atmospheric data from within Venus's clouds, when the biophysicist Harold Morowitz and the astronomer Carl Sagan, already beginning to establish himself as one of the most publicly recognizable and scientifically respected voices in American planetary science, co-authored a paper published in the journal Nature, proposing a specific and carefully reasoned hypothesis that while Venus's surface was clearly incompatible with life, a particular layer of its atmosphere, at an altitude of roughly 50 to 60 kilometers above the surface, might present conditions dramatically more temperate and, at least in principle, potentially compatible with certain forms of microbial life. Morowitz and Sagan noted, based on the atmospheric data available at the time, that within this specific altitude band, temperatures ranged from roughly 0 to around 100 degrees Celsius, and atmospheric pressure approximated something reasonably close to Earth's own sea level pressure, conditions that stood in dramatic contrast to the 800+ degree, 90 times Earth atmosphere hell found at the surface just tens of kilometers below. It's important to be precise about exactly what Morowitz and Sagan were and were not proposing in this original 1967 paper, because the idea has sometimes been popularly distorted in the decades since into something considerably grander and more sensational than the actual, carefully hedged scientific hypothesis the two researchers originally put forward. They were not proposing anything resembling the beautiful, human-like Venusian civilizations described by the 1950s contactees, nor were they proposing complex multicellular organisms of any kind, floating creatures, or anything that popular science fiction had previously imagined inhabiting Venus's skies. The hypothesis was narrowly and specifically about the theoretical possibility of simple microbial life, single-celled organisms broadly analogous to certain extremophile bacteria found in unusually harsh environments on Earth, potentially surviving within the temperate zone of Venus's cloud layer, sustained by whatever nutrients might be available within the droplets of the clouds themselves, in a manner conceptually similar to how certain bacteria on Earth are known to survive, suspended within clouds in our own planet's atmosphere, a genuine and well-documented, if still relatively obscure, area of terrestrial microbiology. The most immediate and scientifically serious challenge to this hypothesis, one that Morowitz and Sagan themselves acknowledged directly in their original paper, involves the chemical composition of Venus's clouds, which subsequent spacecraft measurements confirmed to consist overwhelmingly of concentrated sulfuric acid droplets rather than the water-based clouds found in Earth's atmosphere. Sulfuric acid at the concentrations found in Venus's clouds is intensely corrosive and hostile to the biochemistry of essentially every form of life known on Earth, presenting what most astrobiologists over the following decades regarded as a serious, though not necessarily absolutely insurmountable, obstacle to the cloud life hypothesis. Proponents of the idea, across the following decades of intermittent scientific discussion, pointed out that certain extremophile organisms on Earth have evolved remarkable tolerances to conditions that would destroy most other life, including some organisms capable of surviving in surprisingly acidic environments, and argued that it remained at least conceivable, though entirely unproven, that some analogous form of life could have evolved specific biochemical adaptations allowing it to tolerate or even exploit the specific chemical environment of Venus's cloud layer, an environment quite unlike anything found naturally on Earth, but not, proponents argued, definitionally incompatible with all conceivable forms of biology. Throughout the decades following the original 1967 paper, a small amount of additional circumstantial evidence accumulated that kept the cloud life hypothesis alive as a minor but persistent thread within astrobiology, even as it remained very much a minority position rather than anything approaching scientific consensus. Ultraviolet images of Venus captured by various spacecraft, beginning with early Venera missions and continuing through NASA's Pioneer Venus mission in the late 1970s and subsequent observations, revealed a puzzling pattern of dark streaks and patches within the planet's cloud layer, features that absorb ultraviolet light in a manner that scientists have never fully and definitively explained through purely chemical or physical processes alone. These features, sometimes referred to in scientific literature as the unknown ultraviolet absorber, have been attributed by different researchers to various possible causes, including specific sulfur compounds, iron chloride, or other exotic chemical species that could plausibly account for the observed absorption pattern through ordinary atmospheric chemistry with no biological component whatsoever. But a small number of researchers have periodically raised the alternative possibility, always carefully framed as speculative rather than confirmed, that the unexplained absorption pattern might, at least in part, reflect the presence of some kind of biological pigment, analogous to the pigments certain microorganisms on Earth use to protect themselves from ultraviolet radiation, a suggestion that has never been either confirmed or definitively ruled out by the available data. This state of low-grade, largely dormant scientific interest persisted for more than 5 decades after the original Morowitz and Sagan paper, changing dramatically and quite suddenly in September of 2020 when an international team of researchers led by the astronomer Jane Greaves published findings based on observations conducted using the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope in Hawaii and later corroborated using the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile, reporting the detection of phosphine gas within Venus's atmosphere at an altitude corresponding to the same general temperate cloud layer that Morowitz and Sagan had identified more than half a century earlier as the most plausible location for any hypothetical Venusian life to exist. The announcement generated an immediate and, by the standards of planetary science, genuinely extraordinary wave of international media attention, headlines around the world describing the finding, with varying degrees of appropriate scientific caution, as potential evidence of life on Venus. The reason phosphine specifically generated this level of excitement lies in its particular chemical properties and its known sources here on Earth. Phosphine, a molecule consisting of one phosphorus atom bonded to 3 hydrogen atoms, is, on Earth, produced primarily through 2 general kinds of processes: certain industrial manufacturing processes and, more relevantly to the Venus finding, biological processes carried out by certain anaerobic microorganisms, meaning microorganisms that live and metabolize in environments lacking free oxygen, a category of organism found in settings such as swamps, sewage treatment facilities, and the digestive tracts of certain animals. Phosphine's chemical instability under most planetary atmospheric conditions means that its detectable presence in any planetary atmosphere generally implies some ongoing source actively replenishing the gas, since it tends to break down relatively quickly through ordinary atmospheric chemical processes, and the difficulty of identifying any known non-biological process capable of producing phosphine at the reported concentrations under the specific chemical conditions present in Venus's atmosphere was precisely what made the Greaves team's announcement so scientifically provocative, and so immediately and widely reported as a potential, though carefully qualified, biosignature. It is important to emphasize, as the original research team themselves emphasized quite explicitly and repeatedly in their published paper and in subsequent public statements, that the detection of phosphine, even if fully confirmed, would not constitute direct proof of life on Venus, and does not, under any responsible scientific interpretation, imply anything remotely resembling the human-like, technologically advanced Venusian civilizations described by the contactees of the 1950s. At most, and only if every step of the reasoning holds up under further scrutiny, the finding would suggest the possible presence of some form of simple microbial life within Venus's temperate cloud layer, and even that conclusion would depend entirely on first ruling out every plausible non-biological explanation for the gas's presence, a process of elimination that the scientific community immediately began pursuing with considerable rigor and, as it turned out, considerable disagreement in the months and years following the initial announcement. That disagreement proved substantial and remains, as of the most recent research available, genuinely unresolved rather than definitively settled in either direction. Several independent research teams, reanalyzing the original observational data using different analytical methods and different assumptions about the background noise and calibration of the telescope instruments involved, published findings over the following months and years that variously supported a much lower concentration of phosphine than originally reported, questioned whether the signal represented a genuine detection of phosphine at all, rather than an artifact of the data processing methods used, or proposed specific non-biological chemical pathways involving volcanic outgassing, atmospheric photochemistry, or lightning-driven chemical reactions that some researchers argued could plausibly account for at least some detectable quantity of phosphine without requiring any biological explanation whatsoever. The original research team, for its part, defended significant elements of its original analysis, while also acknowledging and incorporating some of the technical criticisms raised by other researchers, publishing follow-up analyses that maintained, in a more qualified form, that a phosphine signal of some magnitude did appear to be genuinely present in the data, even as the precise concentration and, crucially, its ultimate cause, remained an open and actively contested scientific question. This ongoing scientific back and forth, playing out in peer-reviewed journals and at scientific conferences over the several years since the original 2020 announcement, represents science functioning essentially as it is supposed to function, with an extraordinary and high-profile claim subjected to intense, sustained scrutiny by multiple independent research groups, none of whom have final, unchallenged authority to simply declare the matter settled in either direction, and all of whom are working from the same fundamentally limited and difficult observational data, since obtaining a truly unambiguous answer would require, most astrobiologists and planetary scientists broadly agree, a dedicated spacecraft mission capable of directly sampling Venus's atmosphere at the relevant altitude, rather than continuing to rely solely on remote spectroscopic observation conducted from telescopes on or near Earth, however sophisticated those telescopes may be, That recognition that only a dedicated mission to Venus's atmosphere could truly resolve the phosphine question and the broader cloud life hypothesis it revived has fed directly into a genuine renewal of scientific and institutional interest in returning to Venus after several decades during which the planet had received considerably less space agency attention and funding than Mars, a world that had, in the intervening decades, become the dominant focus of astrobiology-motivated planetary exploration, thanks in part to its comparatively hospitable and far more easily explored surface conditions. In the years following the 2020 phosphine announcement, NASA selected 2 new missions specifically targeting Venus as part of its Discovery program, one named Da Vinci, designed to send a descent probe directly through Venus's atmosphere, sampling its chemical composition in detail as it falls, including the specific cloud layer altitude relevant to the cloud life hypothesis, and another named Veritas, designed to conduct detailed radar mapping of Venus's surface to better understand its geology and volcanic history, a factor directly relevant to evaluating some of the proposed non-biological explanations for the phosphine signal involving ongoing volcanic activity. The European Space Agency has separately advanced its own Venus-focused mission, named Envision, designed to complement the American missions with additional atmospheric and surface observation capability. And at least one privately funded mission effort has also been publicly announced with the specific stated goal of searching Venus's cloud layer directly for biosignatures, reflecting just how significantly the 2020 phosphine controversy reinvigorated broader scientific and institutional interest in a planet that had, for several prior decades, received comparatively modest, dedicated exploration attention. There is a genuine and, in its own understated way, quite remarkable historical irony worth sitting with at this point in our story. The most extraordinary claims ever made about Venusian life, the claims of the 1950s contactees, whom we examined in detail earlier in this series, described a beautiful, spiritually advanced, fully human-like civilization, and those specific claims were definitively and comprehensively refuted by direct spacecraft measurement within less than a decade of first being made, refuted so thoroughly and so specifically that essentially no serious scientist today gives them any credence whatsoever as a literal, physical claim about conditions on Venus. And yet, in a development that none of the original contactees nor their harshest contemporary critics could have fully anticipated, actual mainstream, peer-reviewed, institutionally funded science did eventually return to the question of whether Venus might harbor some form of life after all, not on its surface, and not in any form remotely resembling the elegant human-like beings Adamski and his contemporaries described meeting, but potentially in a far more modest and biologically humble form within the temperate band of its clouds, sustained not by any spiritually advanced technology, but by whatever basic biochemical processes might allow simple microorganisms to tolerate an environment of concentrated sulfuric acid droplets suspended some 50 kilometers above a scorched and crushing planetary surface. The question remains, as of this telling, genuinely unresolved, awaiting the results of spacecraft missions that have not yet reached Venus, a fitting continuation, in its own way, of a scientific mystery that has now persisted in one form or another for the better part of 4 centuries since Galileo first found that Venus's disk would show him nothing more than its phases and never, no matter how carefully he or any subsequent observer looked, the truth of what lay beneath its clouds. Having now traced the full scientific arc of this story, from ancient omen to telescope mystery, from swamp hypothesis to spacecraft-confirmed hell, and finally to a genuinely open and still active modern scientific question about microbial cloud life, it's worth turning, in the next part of this series, to a different and in some ways more human question. Why, given everything the spacecraft data has definitively established about Venus's surface, does the broader cultural myth of the Venusians, the beautiful, spiritually advanced beings described by Adamski and his contemporaries, continue to persist, referenced, echoed, and in some communities still sincerely believed, decades after the scientific case against their existence was closed beyond any reasonable dispute? That question of cultural persistence and what it reveals about the underlying human needs and impulses the Venusian myth has always served, regardless of its physical accuracy, is where our story turns next. Cultural legacy: why the myth endures. By the standard of hard physical evidence, the question of Venusian visitors was closed decades ago. Mariner 2's temperature readings, the Venera lander's direct surface measurements, and the photographs of a scorched, rocky, orange-lit landscape beneath a crushing sulfuric acid sky left no meaningful scientific room for a civilization of tall, blonde, serene beings living beneath those clouds. And yet, the idea did not simply vanish once the spacecraft data came in. It changed shape, moved into new communities, adapted its claims to accommodate the new evidence, and in various forms continues to circulate today, more than 60 years after the first probes reached Venus, and more than 70 years after George Adamski first described his desert encounter. Understanding why requires looking beyond the physical evidence entirely and asking a different kind of question. What psychological and social needs did the Venusian myth actually serve for the people who believed it? And why do those needs persist even after the specific factual claims underlying the myth have been thoroughly discredited? One of the most illuminating pieces of research relevant to this question comes not from a study of the Venusian contactees specifically, but from a closely related case that unfolded at almost exactly the same historical moment, and that has become one of the most frequently cited studies in the entire field of social psychology. In the early 1950s, a small group in the American Midwest, led by a woman writing under the pseudonym Marion Keech, came to believe, based on messages she said she received through automatic writing from advanced beings, that a catastrophic flood would destroy much of the world on a specific predicted date in December of 1954, and that the group's members, as a reward for their faith and preparation, would be rescued at the last moment by a spacecraft sent from a distant world. The message is identified as the planet Clarion, a detail that researchers of this era's contactee movement have long noted bears a striking and almost certainly non-coincidental resemblance to the same planet name used independently by the contactee Truman Bethurum, whose claims we examined earlier in this series, in his own account of meeting the Venusian-associated Captain Ora Raines. A team of social psychologists, led by Leon Festinger, recognizing an unusual and valuable research opportunity, embedded themselves within this group in the months leading up to the predicted event, specifically in order to observe firsthand how the group's members would respond when the predicted flood and the promised rescue inevitably failed to occur. What Festinger and his colleagues documented, published in 1956, in a book that has since become a foundational text in the psychology of belief, was not the collapse of faith that a naive observer might expect to follow such a clear and unambiguous disconfirmation. Instead, a significant portion of the group's most committed members responded to the failure of the prophecy not by abandoning their belief, but by intensifying it, developing a revised explanation. In this specific case, the idea that the group's faith and devotion had been so powerful that it had convinced the beings to spare the world from the flood after all, and, notably, several previously reluctant members who had kept their beliefs private before the failed prediction began actively proselytizing and seeking media attention afterward, a pattern that ran directly counter to what a simple model of belief based purely on evidence would predict. Festinger's research gave rise to the concept of cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when a person holds two contradictory ideas at once, in this case, a strong prior belief and a piece of direct evidence contradicting it. And the theory holds that resolving this discomfort does not always, or even usually, proceed through the straightforward path of discarding the belief in light of the evidence, particularly when a belief has been costly to hold, when a person has given up significant time, money, social standing, or relationships in service of that belief, and particularly when the belief is held within a supportive community of fellow believers who reinforce one another's convictions. Disconfirming evidence can paradoxically strengthen rather than weaken commitment as believers work collectively to develop new interpretations that preserve the core of the belief while accommodating, reframing, or simply setting aside the inconvenient new information. This pattern, first rigorously documented in Festinger's study of a group whose beliefs were strikingly parallel to the Venusian contactee movement in their basic structure and historical moment, offers a directly relevant lens for understanding why the underground city hypothesis and the higher dimensional being hypothesis, both discussed in an earlier part of this series as responses some contactees and their followers developed to accommodate the Mariner and Venera data, emerged in the specific creative form that they did, preserving the core belief in Venusian contact while relocating its testable claims to a domain where physical spacecraft evidence could no longer directly challenge it. This same underlying psychological pattern helps explain the trajectory of one of the most enduring institutional legacies of the entire contactee era, an organization called the Unarius Academy of Science, founded in 1954 by Ernest Norman and his wife Ruth Norman in the same general cultural moment and geographic region, Southern California, that produced Adamski and several of the other contactees examined earlier in this series. Unarius, whose name is an acronym standing for Universal Articulate Interdimensional Understanding of Science, taught an elaborate cosmology involving past lives, karmic healing, and contact with a confederation of advanced extraterrestrial civilizations, drawing on many of the same broad thematic elements we have traced throughout this series, back to the theosophical and ascended master traditions, including teachings about spiritually advanced beings and interplanetary confederations broadly similar in spirit to the Venusian material popularized by Adamski and Van Tassel, though Unarius developed its own distinct terminology and mythology over time rather than remaining tied specifically and exclusively to Venus. Following Ernest Norman's death in 1971, Ruth Norman continued leading the organization for more than 2 decades, during which she made a series of specific predictions about the imminent arrival of a fleet of extraterrestrial spacecraft. Predictions that, like the flood predicted by Marian Keech's group decades earlier, failed to materialize on their stated timelines, and yet the organization continued operating, producing an extensive catalog of self-published books, and, in a detail that reflects its adaptation to changing media technology over the decades, an enormous archive of low-budget educational videos, and it continues to operate today from its headquarters in El Cajon, California, maintaining an active, if now considerably smaller, community of adherents and continuing to produce new video content for public and member audiences, a striking real-world illustration of exactly the same belief preservation dynamic Festinger documented, playing out continuously across more than 7 decades. Beyond these specific organized religious and spiritual movements, the broader Venusian and Space Brother mythology that Adamski and his contemporaries popularized fed into and became substantially absorbed by the much larger, more diffuse New Age spiritual movement that expanded rapidly in American and European culture from the 1970s onward. The entity Ashtar, first introduced to public audiences through George Van Tassel's channeling in the 1950s, as discussed in an earlier part of this series, continued to be channeled by a long succession of later spiritual teachers over the following decades, developing into what practitioners refer to as the Ashtar Command, a body of ongoing channeled teaching that continues to be produced and consumed within contemporary New Age and specifically UFO religion communities, often incorporating updated technological and environmental themes, concerns about climate change, and planetary healing in more recent iterations, for instance, layered onto the same basic underlying narrative structure of benevolent, spiritually advanced beings from Venus and other worlds watching over and periodically communicating with a receptive human audience. This continuity demonstrates that the specific factual claims about Venus's physical surface conditions, definitively settled by the Mariner and Venera missions decades ago, were never actually the primary source of the myth's ongoing appeal for the communities that continued to sustain it. The scientific facts about Venus's surface were, in an important sense, almost beside the point for believers whose engagement with the material was fundamentally spiritual, communal, and psychological rather than narrowly empirical in the first place. It's worth asking directly, at this point in our series, what specific psychological and social needs the Venusian myth actually served for the people who found it compelling, because identifying those needs helps explain both why the myth arose when it did, and why elements of it have proven so durable even in the face of comprehensive scientific refutation. The historical moment of the myth's origin, the early Cold War period marked by pervasive nuclear anxiety, offers one clear and well-documented thread, discussed at several points earlier in this series. The contactees consistently described their Venusian visitors as deeply concerned about humanity's nuclear weapons and eager to help guide Earth away from self-destruction, a message that offered genuine psychological comfort to an anxious public living under the constant, actively cultivated specter of atomic annihilation. Comfort that official Cold War civil defense messaging, focused on survival instructions rather than reassurance, conspicuously failed to provide. This specific historical anxiety has, of course, evolved considerably in the decades since, but successor anxieties about environmental destruction, about political instability, about a general sense of civilizational precariousness, have continued to provide a comparable emotional backdrop against which updated versions of the same essential message, that wiser and more benevolent beings are watching over humanity and may yet help guide us toward a better future, continue to find a receptive audience. A second and closely related thread involves a need that long predates the Cold War and will likely long outlast any of its specific anxieties: the deep and evidently widespread human desire not to feel cosmically alone. The question of whether intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe touches on some of the oldest and most fundamental questions human beings ask about their own significance and place in the cosmos. And the Venusian contactee narrative offered a uniquely direct, personal, and emotionally satisfying answer to that question, not an abstract scientific possibility of microbial life on some distant exoplanet discovered through a telescope, but an immediate, personal, face-to-face encounter with a being who could speak, however telepathically, of shared cosmic community and purpose. This desire for direct personal contact with something larger than oneself, for evidence that human consciousness and human moral striving matter within a universe that can otherwise feel indifferent and vast beyond comprehension, is a need that formal science, however successful it may be at answering narrower empirical questions, is not particularly well equipped to satisfy, since science, properly practiced, generally offers probabilistic assessments and open questions rather than the kind of definitive, personally meaningful encounter the contactees claim to have experienced and that their audiences found so compelling. A third thread, more sociological than psychological in character, involves the genuine sense of community and belonging that the contactee movement and its later New Age and UFO religion successors provided to their members. The Giant Rock Conventions, organized by George Van Tassel, and the Missouri Gatherings, organized by Buck Nelson, both discussed earlier in this series, brought together thousands of participants who found, within these events and the ongoing communities that grew up around them, genuine social connection, shared purpose, and a sense of participating in something significant and forward-looking, benefits that operated substantially independently of whether the underlying factual claims about Venusian visitors happened to be true. This is not a phenomenon unique to the Venusian contactee movement specifically. It reflects a much broader pattern well documented across many different kinds of alternative belief communities, in which the social and emotional benefits of participation, belonging, shared identity, a sense of possessing special or hidden knowledge unavailable to outsiders, can sustain a community's cohesion and continued existence considerably beyond the point at which its founding factual claims have been credibly challenged or refuted by outside evidence. The Venusian myth's persistence also benefits from a dynamic common to many other enduring pieces of modern folklore that similarly resist full scientific resolution, a comparison worth drawing briefly here because it illuminates something important about how these kinds of beliefs generally function within a culture. Claims about Bigfoot or other undiscovered large animals, and claims about the lost civilization of Atlantis share a similar basic structure with the Venusian contactee narrative. Each offers a compelling, emotionally resonant story that fills a gap left by incomplete or ambiguous evidence. Each has been repeatedly investigated and, in the assessment of the great majority of relevant scientific experts, found to lack credible supporting evidence, and yet each continues to attract dedicated communities of believers and investigators who find the underlying narrative sufficiently compelling to sustain ongoing interest regardless of the accumulated negative evidence. In each case, the myth persists not because the scientific case against it is weak, but because the myth is doing psychological and social work that has relatively little to do with its literal factual accuracy, providing mystery, wonder, community, and a sense of hidden significance in a world that can otherwise feel thoroughly explained and, for some people, correspondingly disenchanted. The rise of the internet, and more specifically of video sharing platforms and online communities dedicated to paranormal and extraterrestrial topics, has provided the Venusian myth and its many descendants with a significantly expanded and considerably more accessible platform than the contactees of the 1950s could have imagined, one that does not require the physical gathering of a giant rock convention or a Missouri farm meeting to sustain a sense of community among believers. Contemporary online content addressing the history of the contactee movement, Adamski's specific claims, and the broader question of Venusian visitors continues to attract a substantial ongoing audience, an audience that includes both sincere believers continuing to explore and defend various elements of the original claims, and a considerably larger audience engaging with the material as a matter of historical curiosity, entertainment, or simple fascination with a genuinely strange and colorful chapter of 20th century cultural history, a category of engagement that this very documentary series itself is, in its own way, a contemporary example of. What the full arc of this cultural persistence ultimately reveals, when considered alongside the comprehensive scientific case against Venusian habitability established by decades of direct spacecraft measurement, is a genuinely important and broadly applicable insight about human psychology and belief formation, one that extends well beyond this specific topic. Physical evidence, however comprehensive and however definitively it settles a narrow empirical question, does not automatically or completely settle the deeper psychological and social needs that gave rise to a belief in the first place. Adamski's claims about meeting Orthon in the California desert have been thoroughly, and in the assessment of the great majority of researchers who have examined the case in detail, convincingly discredited as a literal, factual account of contact with a physical being from the planet Venus. But the underlying human needs his story spoke to, the need for cosmic companionship, the need for reassurance in the face of overwhelming existential anxiety, the need for community and shared meaning, and the deep, very old human impulse to look at a bright light in the evening sky and wonder whether someone might be looking back, are needs that predate Adamski by thousands of years, as we saw in the earliest part of this series when we traced Venus's mythological significance back to ancient Babylon, and they will very likely continue to find new expression in new forms long after the specific details of the 1950s contactee movement have faded further still into historical memory. That is the note our story arrives at as we turn, in the final part of this series, to a direct and honest reckoning with everything we have covered, what we actually know about Venus today, what we once collectively believed, and what genuine, still open questions remain. Conclusion: what we know, what we believed, and what remains open. We can now draw together the different threads of this story and ask, plainly and directly, the question this series set out to answer: were the Venusians real? The honest answer, supported by the full weight of the physical evidence gathered across more than a dozen spacecraft missions to Venus since 1962, is no, not in the way George Adamski and the contactees who followed him described them. There is no civilization of tall, blonde, serene beings living on the surface of Venus, because the surface of Venus, as directly measured by Mariner 2 and confirmed in exhaustive detail by the Soviet Venera landers, reaches temperatures hot enough to melt lead, sits under atmospheric pressure roughly 90 times greater than sea level on Earth, and lies beneath clouds composed not of water vapor but of concentrated sulfuric acid. No known form of biology, and certainly no advanced human-like civilization capable of building spacecraft and traveling to Earth, could exist under those conditions. This is not a matter of scientific opinion subject to reasonable dispute. It is a matter of direct physical measurement, obtained by instruments that had no ideological stake in the outcome, repeated across multiple independent missions by two competing Cold War space programs, and confirmed by every subsequent observation in the more than half a century since. And yet it would be a genuine mistake, and in its own way, a disservice to the real history we have spent this series examining, to end the story there with a simple verdict of false and nothing more. The Venusian contactee phenomenon was never merely a matter of a few individuals telling a lie that science eventually disproved. It was a rich, layered, and genuinely revealing episode in 20th century cultural and intellectual history, one that drew together several distinct threads we have traced carefully across this series, centuries of ancient human reverence for a mysteriously bright and behaviorally distinctive point of light in the evening and morning sky, 3.5 centuries of legitimate scientific uncertainty about what that light actually was once telescopes revealed it to be a cloud-covered world rather than a star, decades of popular science journalism and pulp fiction that filled the resulting evidentiary gap with vivid, internally consistent imagery of Venusian jungles and swamps, and a much older, largely unacknowledged current of American esoteric spiritual teaching running from Blavatsky's Theosophy through the specific Sanat Kumara doctrine and Guy Ballard's I Am activity that had already populated Venus with spiritually advanced, human-like beings decades before Adamski ever walked into the California desert. None of these threads alone fully explains the contactee movement, together converging at a specific and unusually receptive historical moment defined by atomic age anxiety and rapid aerospace technological change. They explain it quite well. What the historical record shows us about George Adamski specifically, and about Howard Menger, Truman Bethurum, the fabricated case of Cedric Allingham, Buck Nelson, and George Van Tassel's channeled Ashtar material, is a genuinely fascinating case study in how extraordinary claims arise, spread, and sustain themselves within a receptive culture, largely independent of whether those claims can withstand rigorous physical scrutiny. The photographic evidence Adamski presented did not survive careful technical examination, resembling, as multiple independent researchers demonstrated through their own reconstructions, ordinary household hardware photographed under favorable conditions rather than genuine images of an alien scout craft. The witness affidavits that Adamski's supporters cited as corroboration never actually confirmed the central and most extraordinary claim, the personal meeting and telepathic communication with a being from Venus, since that portion of his account took place, by his own description, while he was alone and out of sight of his companions. The broader pattern across nearly every major contactee case we examined, stories that grew more elaborate and more specific with each retelling rather than remaining fixed as a genuinely remembered singular event would be expected to do, is exactly the pattern that careful, skeptical investigation would predict to find in fabricated or substantially embellished accounts. And it is precisely the pattern that dedicated researchers, including some who began their investigations quite sympathetic to the broader UFO phenomenon, in fact did find case after case throughout the 1950s and in the decades of subsequent historical research since. At the same time, honesty about this history requires acknowledging that we cannot always know, with complete certainty, the precise inner motivations of every individual contactee we have discussed in this series. Some, like the likely creators of the Cedric Allingham hoax, appear to have been engaged in conscious, deliberate fabrication, constructed with a specific and traceable intent, in that particular case apparently satirical, to exploit and comment on the public appetite for contact stories that Adamski's success had so effectively demonstrated. Others, including Adamski himself, by the assessment of many who knew him personally, seem to have genuinely believed in the importance and validity of their own experiences and their broader philosophical message. Whatever one ultimately concludes about the specific factual accuracy of the physical claims involved, a distinction between sincere belief and conscious fabrication that matters considerably for how we understand these individuals as people, even though though it does not change the underlying scientific conclusion about what conditions actually exist on Venus. It's worth being equally clear and equally fair about what the scientific establishment got right and where its own institutional response, while ultimately vindicated by the spacecraft data, was not always handled with complete consistency or transparency during the years when the underlying question remained genuinely open. The Robertson Panel's 1953 recommendations, discussed earlier in this series, reveal an institutional apparatus more concerned, in certain respects, with managing public psychology and Cold War national security anxieties than with purely disinterested scientific investigation of the broader UFO phenomenon, a fact that later fed, understandably, though not always accurately, into a persistent strand of public suspicion about government transparency on this topic that continues to circulate in various forms today, extending well beyond the specific and comparatively narrow question of Venusian contact claims that this series has focused on. It is possible, and this series has tried throughout to hold both of these positions simultaneously without contradiction, to fully accept the definitive scientific case against Venusian habitability, while also recognizing that government institutions of the era did not always handle the broader UFO phenomenon with complete consistency, and that this institutional imperfection, real as it was, does not change or weaken the specific, separate, and overwhelming physical evidence against surface life on Venus that this series has documented in detail. The most genuinely surprising turn in this entire story, and the one that this series has tried to give full and careful weight, is the way actual mainstream science eventually returned to the question of Venusian life, not through any vindication of the contactee's specific claims, but through an entirely separate and far more modest scientific pathway. Carl Sagan and Harold Morowitz's 1967 identification of a temperate cloud layer high in Venus's atmosphere, and the genuine, ongoing, and still scientifically unresolved controversy sparked by the 2020 detection of phosphine gas at that same altitude. This is not a story that neatly confirms either the contactees or their harshest critics. It confirms neither the beautiful, human-like Venusian civilizations described by Adamski and his contemporaries, an idea for which there is no credible supporting evidence whatsoever and overwhelming evidence against it, nor a simple total absence of any further scientific mystery regarding the planet. Since the phosphine question, along with the still unexplained ultraviolet absorption patterns in Venus's clouds first noted decades earlier, remains a genuinely open and actively debated area of legitimate scientific research, one that the Da Vinci, Veritas, and Envision missions currently in development are specifically intended to help resolve over the coming years. This distinction between the thoroughly and definitively refuted claim of an advanced Venusian civilization and the genuinely open, still scientifically live question of simple microbial life in Venus's clouds is one of the most important takeaways this series hopes to leave with anyone who has followed it through to this final part. It is entirely possible and intellectually necessary to hold a position of complete confidence about the first question while maintaining appropriate scientific humility and curiosity about the second. Being confident that Venus's surface is uninhabitable does not require dismissing every possible avenue of astrobiological inquiry related to the planet as equally discredited pseudoscience, and recognizing that a legitimate scientific question about cloud layer microbial life remains open does not require lending any credibility whatsoever to the specific, thoroughly disproven claims of the 1950s contactee movement. Good scientific thinking, the kind this series has tried to model throughout, requires exactly this kind of careful discrimination between claims that have been definitively tested and refuted, and claims that remain genuinely uncertain and worthy of continued, rigorous investigation. There is a final observation this series wants to leave you with, one that returns us to the very beginning of this story, to that bright, unmistakable light appearing low in the western sky just after sunset. the same light that Babylonian priests tracked across 21 years of careful observation, that Egyptian astronomers folded into their religious cosmology, that Maya rulers used to time their military campaigns with mathematical precision achieved without any telescope at all, that Galileo used to help prove the Earth itself moves around the sun, that generations of astronomers speculated might hide a warm, wet, life-bearing world beneath its permanent clouds, that pulp fiction writers filled with jungles and monsters and civilizations, that esoteric teachers populated with spiritually advanced masters guiding humanity's development, and that, in November of 1952, a man walked into the California desert believing he might meet someone who called that light home. Every single one of these responses to Venus, the ancient omen reading, the telescope-era scientific speculation, the pulp fiction imagination, the esoteric spiritual teaching, and finally, the contactee movement itself represents a different chapter in the same essentially continuous human project, looking at something we do not fully understand and trying, using whatever intellectual and cultural tools happen to be available in a given era, to make sense of it, to fill in what we cannot yet see with what we most need or most hope to find there. Venus, it turns out, did not need to be inhabited by an advanced civilization of serene, blonde space travelers to be one of the most genuinely revealing objects in our entire solar system. Not about the physical universe alone, but about ourselves, about the specific historical anxieties, hopes, and inherited spiritual traditions that shaped what an entire generation of Americans and Europeans found themselves willing to believe about their closest planetary neighbor during one of the most uncertain decades of the 20th century. The clouds that have hidden Venus's true surface from every Earth-based telescope in history have finally been pierced, not by imagination or channeled communication, but by actual spacecraft, engineered across two competing national space programs, carrying real instruments that returned real numbers. 887 degrees Fahrenheit, 90 times Earth's atmospheric pressure, a rocky, sun-baked landscape glowing faintly orange beneath a permanent haze of sulfuric acid. That is the truth of Venus's surface, established beyond reasonable scientific dispute. What remains beautifully, genuinely unresolved, is the much smaller and much more modest question of whether, in the narrow temperate band of clouds floating far above that inferno, something simpler than a civilization, something more like the earliest and hardiest forms of life found in Earth's own most extreme environments, might yet be found waiting. The spacecraft now being built to answer that question will, within the coming years, finally tell us. Until then, the light still appears, exactly on schedule, low in the western sky just after sunset, exactly as it has for every human being who has ever looked up and wondered, for the past 4,000 years, precisely what it might mean. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.